No, I just find it funny, if you will. Okay, now they do the little touching family thing, and the little girl looks away. That's not my daddy.
NASA faking ISS footage. I did a test. Now, I had no idea what the result was going to be. As you can see here, the people in the foreground should have a nice consistent fade out to the background. But you see around the shirts, the blue shirts, the edges aren't properly defined as they should be. And that's because they're filming in front of a blue screen, which is pretty stupid, filming a blue shirt in front of a blue screen. But recently, it's been proven. It's a fact. Check this out. Here you can see Old Man Bush is being wheeled into the NASA control room, or the NASA studios, as the case may be. And you can see right there in the background on one of their stupid display screens, old Tim Peake, that first Pommy astronaut, has a blue screen right behind him. They're showing us, it's right in our face, that they use blue screen for their footage. They're taking the piss. They're making a monkey out of you and me and everybody else. But luckily, we've figured it out. NASA, you're a bunch of lying, deceptive, Freemasonic Satan worshippers. I wonder how much Old Man Bush is actually taking in here. Or is he having a big chuckle to himself, knowing that they're deceiving the whole world here? Like, no doubt they've got a clone of his body somewhere that they're using for spare parts, you know? Like, they keep these old dudes going for a long time. Like, look at these guys. Henry Kissinger, age 92. Zbigniew Brzezinski, age 87. George Soros, he's just a little boy at age 85. I bet he's still using parts from his clone. I have absolutely no doubt of that. And George H.W. Bush, age 91. Look at him. Look at all these guys. It's pure evil. They're barely even human anymore.
NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God?
Now, there's a lot of problems with this, image that people have noted already. Clouds obviously don't move, and if this was taken over a period of time, clouds move pretty fast. NASA has South Parked a dim moon image because they said it's the dark side of the moon, so obviously we think the image needs to appear darker, but it's passing right in front of the Earth, in front of the sun, sun, full moon, so that means it should be bright, really bright, bright as the clouds.
Under the sun, look at this one supposed astronaut. You can see right through him here at the very end. He becomes transparent. I mean, this is just a sick joke that they're playing. I mean, this is obviously just the so-called elite, those behind the scenes, just putting little Easter eggs in here, mocking those that believe in the International Space Station.
Scientists on the moon. Click on this picture right here. Supposedly the same mission, same guys that took the picture of the most famous picture of our Earth. I'm going to do save image as, and let's see, Apollo Moon. Let's call it Apollo Moon 17. Okay, I'm going to go to image, adjust, levels, and I'm going to bring the levels over here, and I'm going to bring the levels up. Uh-oh, what is that?
Oh, wow.
Yeah, wow. Why is there a square box around the Earth allegedly taken from the scientists on the moon in Apollo 17? And people wonder why I don't trust NASA. Sure. Then you got other pictures like this, the blue marble, right, that come out. Okay, well, there's a big problem with the blue marble, and I'm going to zoom in here and show you what the problem is. These are all composite images where they are really not very good at Photoshop because they're using the Photoshop clone tool to replicate clouds. This cloud is a copy of this cloud. See the formations? They're identical. Identical formations, side by side.
Wow.
Right? These right here, side by side, side by side. See this kind of W-looking shape right here, replicated right here. This cloud is exactly the same as that cloud. Same clouds right there, and same thing on the other side of the world. They got the same thing going on. They got careless. Here, look, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of the same formations replicated right there. So you're telling me that we could take pictures of Jupiter and Saturn, huge, massive planets, and now we're out going to Pluto, but we don't have one legitimate picture of the Earth from space that's not a composite? Really? Why, Rob, why are you looking into this? This is why. Because we're believing a bunch of Luciferian Nazis. This is Jet Propulsion Laboratory, NASA, California Institute of Technology, right? They have this video right here. For some reason, every time I click on it on this particular computer, I'm not able to open it, but I embedded it on my blog. The exact same video is embedded in my blog off of YouTube. Somebody had taken it and made a YouTube out of it. Here are other blue marbles, okay, allegedly done by NASA. And if you don't believe me, here's the space.com website where I got the picture. Here's the nasa.gov website where I got this picture. Okay, they can't even get the scale right. Look how big the United States is in this one versus this one. Colors all off. I mean, so far all of these are crap. Here's that picture, that same video, okay, from Jet Propulsion Laboratory. Now, this is allegedly from the space probe Galileo at 6:10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time on December 11th, 1990, when the spacecraft was about 1.3 million miles from the planet. Okay, first of all, you got a tiny probe 1.3 million miles away from the Earth, supposedly, that is keeping a perfectly steady shot of a spinning ball that's supposedly also moving at 67,000 miles around the sun in orbit. And yet it maintains a perfect synchronous shot of the Earth. But this is what really got me. Not a single cloud is changing in any way. This is 25-hour time-lapse video. Supposedly 25 hours of the Earth rotating. Not a single cloud is changing, morphing, moving, dissipating, arriving. Nothing.
Wow.
This is a load of crap. And you got a lot of the same cloud features, too. You start noticing in a lot of pictures, they're using a cloud map on various software to generate these.
NASA has south parked a dim moon image because they said it's the dark side of the moon. So obviously we think the image needs to appear darker, but it's passing right in front of the Earth, in front of the sun, sun, full moon, so that means it should be bright, really bright, bright as the clouds. All right, let's check this image out here. Everybody might remember this one. This is the famous moon transiting the Earth in front of NASA's Discover satellite. That's 1 million miles away, parked out in geosynchronous orbit. Okay, let's right-click this bad boy, put it in Photoshop. It's a GIF for animated purposes, but the cool thing about GIFs is you can actually open them up in Photoshop and you can see all the layers that the GIF is made out of. Kind of cool. So let's zoom in here and check it out. Alright, you start activating layers and the moon comes into frame. But what is this? Why is the leading edge of the moon green? Obviously, that shouldn't be like that. So, what's going on here is NASA has south parked a dim moon image because they said it's the dark side of the moon. So obviously we think the image needs to appear darker, but it's passing right in front of the Earth, in front of the sun, full moon, so that means it should be bright, really bright, bright as the clouds. In fact, there's more green fringing. Keep turning on these layers. Obviously they were able to delete the green fringing on the leading edge as it left the frame, but they were pretty lazy here as it exited the frame. More green fringing. Now, it seems to me like they just used some green screen software and plucked or tried to get a nice clean image, but they couldn't because here's a bunch of pixel noise all over the place. That means nobody actually did anything. They clicked a button and they tried to use the algorithm to remove the green. Didn't do a very good job of that. Alright, let's go straight to the horse's mouth here and download the image right off of NASA's website and open it into Photoshop. Okay, now one thing that you should know is there are all kinds of different blacks. So in order to see what's actually black or slightly black, you invert the image. Now, In doing this, you reveal some very interesting characteristics about our perfectly round sphere globe Earth here, which we're told it's an oblate spheroid and not perfectly round. But Photoshop round tool selection marquee thing here will disagree. Now, as I make a selection here, and let me scoot this back on the screen. Okay, I'm not exact size, but it doesn't matter for this because I'll show you why here in a minute. The marquee tool has a very distinct stair-step shape in the pixel definition. And as you can see here, NASA's image, as you toggle around between the feathered edge, that the stair-step matches perfectly with an exact sphere. That means they used Photoshop to delete the background. But they didn't do a very good job. As you can see here, there's a bunch of little random pixel anomalies floating in space. The most obvious that nobody really saw until you invert the image is up here. This is a strip of blue sky cloud that somebody forgot to erase. Now, this is very obvious when you invert the image back. And look at that. That is blue water, people. And it should not be out in space unless this was a retouched image. This is not an official photograph of Earth from 1 million miles away, as they're saying. Clarity and definition that just can't be taken from a 4 megapixel camera from 1 million miles away. I mean, the detail's astonishingly ridiculous. I mean, you can clearly make out the Central Valley in California. You know, you can see land details. I'm sorry, 4 megapixels from 1 million miles away. I don't know. All right, moving on. Let's check out Commander Scott Kelly's photograph of the Earth, Moon, Venus transit. Really beautiful image, but let's see what we can find here. He's a Nikon user, as are all the astronauts. That will become of importance here later on. I'll mention that in a minute. First, let's open it and do what we did before. We'll invert the image, and we'll see if there's any strange things afoot. My suspicion was the lens flare. It looked too Hollywoodish to me. It looked too much like a plug-in or a filter. But I was blown away when I saw this really glaringly obvious cover-up of something. Now, to me, it looks like they just took the brush tool and blocked something out by just selecting black. But they didn't use the eyedropper tool to sample the nearest color black. So they're, like I said, blacks aren't all the same once you start looking at it as an inverted image. It looks black. Now they may have blocked something out for artistic reasons, but as soon as you do that, it's a manipulated image, and you can't claim it as authentic. You know, it's now a composite. You know, you've edited it, you've retouched it, and I think they're obligated to mention when they do, and not always in the obfuscated terms of mosaic and composite, as NASA always seems to do.
NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God?
But the one thing that I really dislike about this image is the fact that who's got the real moon? Commander Scott Kelly has a picture of the moon from the space station, and he's 237 miles away from his vantage point. Now, or 237,000 miles away from his vantage point. And this Discover satellite image is 1 million miles away, minus 237 miles the distance between the Earth and the Moon. Yet it looks like a dim, dead rock. If I were to be asked which one is real, well, it looks like Commander Scott Kelly's picture is real, and the NASA one, which they're claiming is real, clearly isn't. It's cut and paste, and a real poor job at that.
NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God? NASA has just released an unbelievable new image of the Earth rising over the moon. It is a composite, but it's supposed to be based on actual photography. They swear. One of the most, if not the most, famous images taken in space is Earthrise, a photo of the Earth taken by the Apollo 8 crew as they rounded the backside of the moon. Before Apollo 11, we went to the moon. We just didn't land there. Man went to the moon 9 times with 60s technology. NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God? Out of those 9 times, NASA landed man on the moon 6 times. It could have been 7 times, but Apollo 13. But we could go to the moon 7 times in just 4 years with 60s technology. And the reason why we don't go back is because you can't ask that question and get an actual answer from NASA. It's taboo. Don't ask NASA any actual questions. Just be happy that these appear in your science books. NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God? NASA has released an incredible new version of that same type of image. I thought that was genuine photography. I don't understand why we can't get genuine photography today, because that picture was taken from a Hasselblad camera by astronauts. And this is a composite. Actual photography doesn't exist in NASA anymore. Everything has to be a composite. So if you have a problem with anything about this image, you can't really say anything because it's been edited. This time taken by the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, a spacecraft that has been studying the moon since 2009. Billions and billions of dollars, we could send man to the moon with 60s technology multiple times in such a short time period. And this is what we get? NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God?
You can see the bus departing.
No, I just find it funny, if you will. Okay, now they do the little touching family thing, and the little girl looks away. That's not my daddy. Well, going nowhere, actually, but they'll tell you they're going to the ISS. Keep an eye on the middle guy.
Then the crew members received the traditional blessing.
This guy
from Russian
is
Orthodox
forever
priests.
wiping his face and forever grabbing people and doing all kinds of stuff. These guys are supposed to be going to space, and if you recall back in the 60s, when they pulled this hoax, remember they all had to be isolated and couldn't be touched. They're about to check out this guy with his hand in his pocket on the left. He's going to grab at this guy. He's going to shake his hand, and they both have like a bunch of filth or slime or whatever, so they wipe off their hand. And they're like, yuck. Yuck. These guys aren't astronauts, man. If you will. Okay, now they do the little touching family thing, and the little girl looks away. That's not my daddy.
You can see the bus departing.
No, I just find it funny. I find it real funny that they're in a room with a wooden floor and they're on a Persian rug. Okay, maybe Turkish, something. You get the point. And they're putting together this suit, and they're calling it a space, and here he goes with the washing, his wiping and washing and always for grabbing people. It's probably because he's sweating. You know what happens is when you dye your hair,
and that was about 4.5 hours.
the next day you're all sweaty because he over-dyed it, so his scalp's sweating. The main point is nobody's going into space. Look at this. It looks like it's in some... So they have this equipment on rickety tables, on Persian rugs, whatever, in a room full of dust. And finally, you see air masks, or not air masks, but just the face covers. But their hands are uncovered.
Thank you.
All right. Boopy suits. So, anyways, each one of these clowns go through. Look, they're on another rug in this dirty old dusty room. You people think we're going to space, man? It's funny.
Oh, by the way, your cousin Steve moved in already. He's keeping me company for the 6 months. Don't worry. See you later, buddy.
Now let's go ahead and break our quarantine once again.
The crew of Expedition 4041 is ready.
Give me that bare naked hand and give me those germs. Please, more germs.
Speaking with the Russian space.
Please, even more germs.
Maxim, good luck.
Do you notice we got the poopy suits on?
And again, 57 a.m. Central Time today for the ride over to launch pad number 1. 12:22 p.m. Central Time, so just this afternoon.
Give me a big hug. Go ahead and give me more of your skin onto my clean suit.
The crew is here at the launch pad.
Give me some of that space debris on my throat more. Give me some skin. You're under arrest for impersonating an astronaut. All of you will be coming in for questioning. Now walk up to the top of the stairs and wave. Then we will cut to a different scene entirely and pretend you're going to the top.
Thank you.
Arrivederci!
And with that, the 3 crew members waving goodbye.
With the rough space luggage!
For the ride to the top of the Soyuz.
And have a great flight.
You are too! We don't go anywhere. We don't go into space. It's all a hoax. Look at us go around the corner and then we will cut to a different version. See, all of a sudden, there we go. You never noticed nothing. You just do as we say, okay? Nobody go to space. Nobody.
You know how the so-called elite love a play on words when they call them astronauts because they've never been in space. That's why they're called astronauts. This is how the elite love to mock all those that believe that somehow these phonies can get into space. What exactly do rockets push against in the vacuum of space? When you see a rocket launch, you always see it go at an angle towards the ocean. All it does is crash back into the ocean. You'll never see that full footage. That's why you see the Kennedy Space Center, for example, right next to the ocean. Exactly like you see in this image here, with this huge arch. Again, nothing more than a rocket that launches and comes back down to Earth. And there are plenty of images of this on Google Images. You can take a look for yourself. I'm not going to show them all here. And someone asked, what about the shuttle landings? I saw it on TV. Very easy to explain. It's just like watching a movie where pieces are edited together. When it's time for the supposed return of the space shuttle from outer space, all they do is have a so-called space shuttle, which is nothing more than an airplane, come in for a landing, as shown on TV. Let's first take a look at these supposed space shuttles. Look at these wings. You think these wings will help this supposedly 80-ton space shuttle come in for a glide landing with no engines? This thing would fall out of the sky like a rock. No way this is a space shuttle. Now, to confirm what NASA even states, this is the text from their website, a glider is a special kind of aircraft that has no engine. The space shuttle flies as a glider during re-entry and landing. During ascent, that's of course the initial flight, thrust is provided by 3 space shuttle main engines at the base of the orbiter and the 2 solid rocket boosters that are joined to the orange external fuel tank. Of course, orange for 33. The solids are jettisoned about 2 minutes into ascent, and the fuel tank is jettisoned as the shuttle enters Earth's orbit. So there are no propellants available to the SSMEs during descent. So make that clear. There's no propellants. Though the engines are still present, the shuttle returns as an unpowered glider. Now let's take a look at this footage. Now first off, look at the elevation that you have here. It's coming in for the landing. No way a glider could be that low and maintain this level throughout if it's a glider. Now here are the engines.
There's a shuttle.
If you think it's this plane in the back, the supposed chaser plane, you are completely deceived, completely deluded, stuck on the lie, and you can't get out of it. Take a look and listen.
Touchdown.
All of these supposed astronauts are all Freemasons, all liars, deceiving the public. This is what Masonry is all about, deception. Take a listen.
How important is the engineering, the fact that we've learned to build such a large structure in Earth orbit?
It's sort of as if, you know, when a little kid is sailing their sailboat in a pond remotely, at some point that then person starts to sail a sailboat up and down the coast, and then they invent and learn and study and figure out all the things they need to do so that maybe then someday they can actually sail out of sight of land. And the station has been orbiting the Earth as if we're sort of sailing within sight of land as we invent. I mean, what do you make the hull out of? How do you navigate? What food do you need? How do you make a toilet that'll work forever? How do you recycle water? How do you recycle the oxygen? It's the main crucible test bed where we've been trying to grind out all the lessons that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, and even that will eventually let us go to the moon, and even further. That will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon, that will eventually let us go to the moon.
Astronauts to the moon.
No, I just find it funny, if you will. Okay, now they do the little touching family thing, and the little girl looks away. That's not my daddy.
We're talking about the origins of the secret space program, and many of you have heard of the Maury Island affair, a very strange, bizarre incident that took place on the Pacific Northwest of the United States. Shortly after Kenneth Arnold, a pilot, gave us the term flying saucer that month, there was a UFO sighting. In this sighting, UFOs evidently crashed, rained debris down upon some civilians, killed a dog, according to the story, wounded a child, according to the story. And between the UFO story, as it was promulgated back in the 1940s, and very serious political and military events of the next 20, 30 years. So, Maury Island affair, there's a UFO sighting shortly after Kenneth Arnold gave us the famous flying saucer story. And a man that we know as Fred Krisman claimed that he had been involved in that incident. He claimed that people had been hurt, that he had pieces of the UFO. And what happened was, individuals of the United States Army Air Force at the time visited Krisman and his partner, Mr. Dahl, and retrieved pieces of this so-called debris of the UFO. They got on a plane, the plane crashed, and both of these Air Force officers died. These are probably the first two victims, mortalities associated with the UFO phenomenon. The first two, there were many more since then, as any student of UFO history knows. So Fred Krisman is this strange guy, you know, a strange background. No one knows too much about him. He seems to have been some kind of confidence man, some kind of criminal, a crook, but maybe also an intelligence agent. Fred Krisman, 1947, seminal event in UFO history. He shows up again 20 years later, being investigated by a district attorney, Jim Garrison, in New Orleans, because of his alleged role in the Kennedy assassination. We'll come back to that in a minute. One of the people investigating the Maury Island affair and all of the UFO incidents that were taking place in the Pacific Northwest in 1947, in the months before and after the famous Roswell crash, was this man, FBI Special Agent in Charge, stationed in Butte, Montana. He was in charge of a bunch of files we call the SM-X files, according to the FBI's own documentation. UFO matters were classified as SM-X, Security Matter-X. These were the original X files. This man's name is Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister is a man who will come up again in our discussion 20 years later as a suspect in the Kennedy assassination. If you saw the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, this was Guy Bannister, the actor playing Guy Bannister. Now we come to another man called Jack Martin. Jack Martin's real name is Edward Suggs. He worked as an investigator for Guy Bannister, as a name that comes up in the files of the Office of Special Investigations of the military as Agent Jack S. Martin, who was investigating UFO incidents in California in 1949. In the movie JFK by Oliver Stone, Jack Lemmon plays Jack Martin. I'm showing you these photographs from the film so you get a kind of context. If you've seen the film, you know that we're talking about real people, real individuals, and their real influence. These photographs have never been seen before in public. You're the first people in the entire world that is actually seeing these photographs, because they're photographs that were given to me personally by a man who was involved with Jack Martin, the Jack Lemmon character in JFK, the man involved, they say, in the Kennedy conspiracy in New Orleans, was also, in addition to being an investigator, in addition to being possibly a man investigating UFO incidents in California, in addition to being heavily involved in the group around Lee Harvey Oswald in New Orleans in 1963, was also a bishop in a church, in a weird church, in a church that no one had ever heard of before, in a church that even Jim Garrison didn't understand. In his own documentation, in his own writings, going back to the House Select Subcommittee on Assassinations, when the United States government was going through an investigation of the assassinations in the 1970s, Jim Garrison wrote a note, copies of which I have, saying, look into this church stuff because I don't understand it. Well, there's Jack Martin dressed as a priest in the 1970s after the Kennedy assassination. His friend and associate was David Ferrie. David Ferrie and Jack Martin both worked for Guy Bannister. David Ferrie, former Eastern Airlines pilot, rabid anti-communist, very much involved in anti-communist activities. He's another bishop of the same church as Jack Martin. And of course, he knew Lee Harvey Oswald, as we know, in the Civil Air Patrol. In the movie, that was David Ferrie, unforgettable guy in a fake wig and fake eyebrows, talking about enigmas wrapped in mysteries, wrapped in puzzles, wrapped in all kinds of things. So this is the David Ferrie character that made famous in the film. And this is an actual photograph of David Ferrie dressed again as a priest, as Jack Martin was. We have co-conspirators in the Kennedy assassination, as we will see, ties back to the UFO and the space program, who were involved in a strange church, a church that didn't really exist except on paper. And this is the church, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. If you review the FBI files, all of the investigations that were undertaken for the Warren Commission, and later by the House Subcommittee in the 1970s, this name will keep coming up, and no one does any background check on it, no one goes any further. Members of this church included a man called Profeta, we'll get to him in a second, David Ferrie, Jack Martin, a man called Carl Stanley, who was mentioned in the FBI files, Tommy Jude Baumler, Thomas Beckham. These are all names familiar to researchers in the Kennedy assassination. They were all members of this church, most of whom were bishops in the church. The church had a lot of bishops, not many priests, and no congregations. Seriously. Just bishops, no priests, no congregations. Rarely did they have a building. This photograph was taken in the only building I ever knew that housed the American Orthodox Catholic Church in the Bronx, where I'm from. And I knew the church personally. I knew these individuals personally. I knew this guy right here. That's Profeta, the guy who created the church. I knew him. And I was a member briefly of this group because I lived practically next door. The other names on this list are extremely important. Ferrie and Martin, we already know, involved in the Kennedy assassination conspiracy, at least according to Jim Garrison. Tommy Jude Baumler was a lawyer in New Orleans, and his claim to fame, as we found out only about a year ago, was that he was the man who incorporated another church, this one called the Process Church of the Final Resurrection, of the Final Judgment, rather, Process Church of the Final Judgment. This was the group that was implicated, rightly or wrongly, in the Charles Manson family, in possibly the Bobby Kennedy assassination. It goes on and on. There are all these churches that swim underneath the radar that have connections to intelligence agencies, the military, and as we will see, to the space program. This was Profeta. I knew this guy personally, a Ukrainian Orthodox priest who left the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to create this church of his own, the American Orthodox Catholic Church. He was picked by Thomas Dewey as the White House chaplain. There was an election between Harry Truman and Thomas Dewey. Everyone thought Dewey would win. Dewey was the Republican. Truman was the Democrat. Truman won by a narrow margin. And Profeta once showed me the letter that he got from Thomas Dewey appointing him as White House chaplain when Dewey thought he had won the election. This is how politically prominent and important he was. On the board of directors of the American Orthodox Catholic Church was J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation of the FBI, the man who gave us the X-Files and Guy Bannister and all the rest. J. Edgar Hoover was a member and on the board of directors of this phony church. Another member was Christopher Maria Stanley. He's now known as Saint Christopher Stanley. He was canonized by the guy who took over when he died. Close associate of all these guys. Ferry Martin tried to implicate him in the Kennedy assassination. He tried to implicate them in the Kennedy assassination. When Profeta had created the American Orthodox Catholic Church, he summoned all the other bishops who had been bishops with him in this church to go to New York and present their bona fides, their bona fides, their credentials to him and to Hoover. The only one who obeyed this was Carl Stanley, Christopher Maria Stanley. Christopher Stanley goes to New York, he goes to Profeta, he signs on, he goes back to his home in Kentucky, he's dead less than a month later. And only 2 weeks after the death of David Ferry, the mysterious death of David Ferry, another bishop in the same church, suddenly the bishops of this church were all being killed. They were all dying under mysterious circumstances, all within a few weeks of each other. This story you have not heard before, because no one knows what to do with the material. No one knows what to do with this information. So when it comes to churches and guys in funny hats, you know, there is some degree of mystery out there and confusion. This is the organization as I, over the years, uncovered it, starting with our friend Profeta over there, to Christopher Stanley, to David Ferry, to Jack Martin. These were all guys implicated in the Kennedy assassination, and they all wore funny hats. The connection was this, another funny hat, that's J. Edgar Hoover in his Masonic Shriner fez, because he was a Freemason, as I think we all know. So there's J. Edgar Hoover, to Guy Bannister, the guy who investigated the UFOs in 1947, the guy who was writing up all these telexes and letters headlined SM-X file, UFO sighting here, UFO sighting there. Down here is Fred Krisman. He was the guy that Bannister was allegedly investigating. And next to Krisman, there's Profeta again. Profeta, who was on the same board of directors of a church as J. Edgar Hoover. All these people working in concert, all these people working together, a phony church, mysterious goings-on, and really weird hats. So what does all this have to do with the space program? You're sitting there thinking, okay, this is all very strange, but what are we here for? In the United States, the space race began on Halloween 1936. And you're looking at this charming group of individuals down there, relaxing in front of a rocket. These were America's first rocket scientists. And this is the launch at Arroyo Seco in California on October 31st, 1936. The very first launching of a rocket by American space engineers. Jack Parsons has a crater on the moon named after him. Jack Parsons was a co-founder of the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, JPL, at Caltech in California. When you watch the space shuttle launches or you read anything about it, you'll always come across JPL all the time. He was a co-founder of JPL. Crater on the moon named after him. Solved a lot of issues regarding solid fuel storage of rocket material. And at the same time, he was a follower of Aleister Crowley. The Aleister Crowley, the infamous magician who created his own cult, his own religion. Parsons himself, at the same time he's working on rockets for the U.S. military, he's also conducting rituals in the desert trying to summon angels and demons. I'm not making this stuff up, in case you're wondering. One of his co-workers, one of his partners in his ritual working, his ritual magic, was L. Ron Hubbard, the man who later went on to found Scientology. Hubbard stole Jack Parsons' money, stole Jack Parsons' girlfriend, ran to Miami, and bought a boat. In later years, Hubbard would speak very fondly of Aleister Crowley, claiming he had met him. He never did. Crowley died in 1947, before Hubbard had even actually heard of him. But Parsons was investigated by the FBI as a security risk because he was involved in occult workings. But at the same time, Parsons is a brilliant scientist. Well, just as he's getting ready to leave the United States through all the pressure of the FBI investigations, there's a mysterious explosion at his home. He dies under very mysterious circumstances. The house literally blows up with him in it. When we're talking today about the space race and the space programs, as we'll be getting into with the other speakers, keep in mind the fact that it began in two important places. It began in Germany with the rocket systems and the rocket development in Germany at Peenemünde, Nordhausen, which we'll get into in a second. But it also started in the United States. And the reason that China is launching rockets today and launching satellites is because of this man. Theodor von Karman was the leader of the group that founded the Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He has a crater on the moon named after him. Born in Hungary, studied in Germany. He was a brilliant rocket scientist as well. And he formed the Jet Propulsion Laboratory with a couple of other people, Frank Molina and, of course, Parsons, Ed Foreman, and a Chinese scientist, another brilliant man called Qian Suisun. Qian Suisun goes on to later fame in another area of rocket science and space science. So von Karman was a guy shown here, by the way, with a Nazi scientist down here. This is Qian up here, and this is von Karman. This scientist, von Karman had known before in Germany and was instrumental in getting him to come to the United States to work on the space program with him. Qian was the man they sent to debrief Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun, of course, was the Nazi scientist that was brought to the United States under something called paperclip. Wernher von Braun we'll get into in more detail just in a few minutes. But Qian was also investigated by the FBI. Everybody involved in the rocket program in the United States in the 1930s and 1940s wound up being investigated by the FBI for one reason or another. He eventually got so sick and tired, he defected to China after all of the harassment he had been undergoing by the FBI. And what happened? He developed China's space program. He creates the Silkworm missile that was used to such effect during the first Iraq invasion. When Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait and all of that, he was sending Scud missiles and all of this. The Silkworms were in use there in the Middle East. So Qian, starting as a patriotic American citizen helping with the space program, through all the suppression by FBI, all the harassment, gives up, basically, goes back to China, and becomes a hero in China. Develops, jump-starts the Chinese space program. Photograph of the team at Fort Bliss, Texas, paperclip members. That's a hell of a lot of Nazi scientists. And not a single funny hat among them, I will point out. One thing that's important to remember about the space program in the United States, until 1957, it was not a civilian program. For the first 10 years, or 15 years of its existence, it was a military program. There was no NASA. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration had not been created yet. So all of these people worked for the military. The rocket program was a military program, and you have to remember that that's the origins of the space program, was with the Army. But at the same time, back in 1941, we have the first jet-assisted takeoff launch in California by the von Karman group. Jack Parsons is here. We have Jack Parsons right here watching the takeoff of the first jet-assisted takeoff plane, a jet-powered plane. So here we have the rocket scientist who's also an occultist and the follower of Aleister Crowley and a member of all kinds of other occult organizations involved in these important events of the rocket program. So the Nazi rocket program, as we know it, started at Peenemünde, was later relocated, and the person in charge of this was General Walter Dornberger, and his assistant was Wernher von Braun. Another important personality in aviation medicine this time was Dr. Hubertus Struckold. He's a man in charge of all sorts of horrendous experiments on living persons in the camps, and yet is considered the father of aviation medicine. He was brought to the United States. He was given his own institute at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, And they had a building named after him until the local Daughters of the American Revolution decided that having a building named after this guy was probably not the best message to send to our next generations of young people studying medicine, so they took the name off. People were aware that Strickhold was basically a monster. Started as Operation Crossbow, Operation Overcast. The British were trying to get the scientists, Russians were trying to get Nazi scientists, and the Americans had their own program, which they then later renamed as Paperclip. It wasn't just the men, the scientists they were bringing over, it was also their documentation. It was also as much machinery as they could possibly get. We are talking about hundreds of railroad cars, freight cars filled with documents and equipment and machinery. Not talking even about the hundreds at first, and then thousands of Nazi scientists that were brought to the United States. We were sold a bill of goods. I mean, the United States was told us, oh, these people are not really Nazis. They were Germans, they were scientists, they were helping out, they were working for us, they really weren't believers. Yeah, right. Why then, if this is so, did we bring the best and the brightest to the United States, give them whatever they wanted, all the resources that they wanted, whatever they needed, whatever they asked for? And the Soviet Union was the first country to launch a satellite into space. If they were really working for the United States and they had become born-again American patriots and card-carrying Republicans, yes, Republicans, how did it happen that we didn't get a rocket into space, we didn't get a satellite into space, that the Russians were the first? Well, what happened? Weren't they sabotaging our space program since the very beginning? These are the true believers. This is just a handful of the people you'll come across when you research this. Walter Dornberger later becomes the head of NASA. Later gets a board position with Bell Aerospace in the United States. Is considered a rabid Nazi by military intelligence officials who are doing background checks in Germany. They've got witness statements, they've got documents, they've got everything they need to put Dornberger in jail for the rest of his life. Those documents are buried. Wernher von Braun was an SS major. There are photographs of Wernher von Braun in an SS uniform. In order to join the SS, you had to prove your racial purity, going back to the year 1750. There had to be no Untermenschen in your background, right? No Jews, no Gypsies, no Slavs, no Democrats. Nobody like that in the background of your racial purity. You had to prove this, and you had to maintain a certain degree of involvement with the SS all the time. The SS was a pagan cult. The SS forbade mention of Christian holidays even in their documentation. The SS was extremely pagan, was extremely anti-Christian, anti-Jewish, anti-everything else. If you had a rank of major in the SS, you did not get that automatically. You got that because you proved yourself. And Wernher von Braun was proven later to have been involved in meetings discussing slave labor requirements for the rocket systems at Peenemünde and also at Mittelbau. He was involved in these discussions. He knew about the killings of prisoners, the torture of prisoners. He was involved in all of that. It didn't matter to Wernher von Braun. At the same time that he's working for us, we bring him over under Paperclip. He's now in the United States. What is he doing? He's sending classified materials out of the country to his comrades back in Germany. We know this. It's part of the documentation. It's part of the record now. These files have been declassified. Wernher von Braun was working against the United States almost from the beginning. This is a scandal, But yet we consider him the father of the American space program. I mean, he's the one who got us to the moon, right? Kurt Debus was the first director of the Kennedy Space Center, the first director of the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral in Florida. He was a member of the SS and the SA, the Sturmabteilung, right, the brown shirts, the stormtroopers, two other Nazi organizations. This is the man who turned in his friends and co-workers to the Gestapo if they made disloyal remarks. This was a true believer, once again. As I say, he was an SS officer. The Allies considered the SS a criminal organization for very good reason. And yet, we put this guy in charge of the Kennedy Space Center. Theodor Zobel, another scientist, performed experiments on prisoners in the wind tunnel experiments. We brought him over. He worked for us. Hubertus Strickhold, as I mentioned, tortured prisoners, killed people just for experiments, dumped them into freezing cold water to see how long they would survive, stuff like that. jumpstarts the Aviation Medicine Institute at Randolph Air Force Base. George Ricci, very famous Nazi, murdered prisoners personally murdered them at the Mittelbau-Dora site, right, is given positions with American corporations in the United States. Emil Salmon worked as an engineer at Wright-Patterson, as you can see. He torched a synagogue. Heinz Gesicke, rocket engineer. His family in the United States during the war was spying for the Nazis. He was fine. He was okay. Denazified. You're wondering right now, is there a secret space program? Well, there was a secret space program in the 1940s for sure. Otto Ambros. We've all heard of Otto Ambros probably. Executive at IG Farben. This is the guy involved in administering the experiments in Zyklon B, the gas that was used in the death camps. He gets a job with W.R. Grace and Company. Leonard Alberts gets a job with the Bechtel Corporation. All big American corporations, all very important members of the military-industrial complex. His co-workers hated him, that he was just too Nazi even for them, and some of them were Nazis. Didn't hurt him at all. They moved him from position to position, but they kept him on. In May 29, 1947, to give you an idea of how badly the Nazi paperclip scientists were sabotaging the American space program. It's like, we have people going across the border this way, you're sending missiles this way, what's up? Well, the Germans in charge of this had sabotaged the guidance system so that it wouldn't go where it was supposed to go. And the American engineers who were responsible for some of these experiments were complaining like mad to the Pentagon, saying that these guys are nuts. They're doing all kinds of crazy stuff. They are not really on our side. These records have since been declassified, not all of them. I mean, God forbid we should declassify records that are 60 years old from World War II, right? You're wondering right now, is there a secret space program? Well, there was a secret space program in the 1940s, for sure. There was a secret space program in the 1950s. The Nazi Party was a cult of true believers. Just because they lost the war doesn't mean they lost their true faith. So they maintained it through thick and thin. They looked down on their captors in the United States. To them, it was a toss-up. Do we go to Russia? Do we go to the United States? There was no ideological choice being made. It was strictly a pragmatic one. Where are we going to get the best deal? So in 1947, we have the Cold War. First, we bomb Mexico, and we apologize for that later. Then we have the Kenneth Arnold sighting. We have the Maury Island affair. We have, famously, Roswell. In 1947, that same year, the CIA is created. The Department of the Air Force is created. A year later, Truman defeats Dewey. I mention this because of the relationship to the other incidents that we're talking about. In 1950, the Korea War begins. Okay, so now we're in Cold War mode. Russians have poured across the border into North Korea. Okay, the brainwashing thing starts. Everybody's freaking out about the weird science that the Russians are using to brainwash American soldiers. Okay, a person very involved in this, in all the hysteria around this, in 1952, holds a seance in a farmhouse in Maine. The man is, no, not the Pope, not the funny hat guy, the other guy, Andrija Puharich. Andrija Puharich was a medical doctor, he was an inventor, he was a military man, a captain in the army, stationed at Camp Detrick, later Fort Detrick, Edgewood Arsenal later, he was stationed at. This is the area of the United States, the military that's involved with chemical and biological weapons. Puharich, however, was involved in trying to weaponize paranormal abilities. Puharich's focus in 1952, as early as 1952, is how can we use ESP, telepathy, all these things, in a military capacity. Since now we're facing a Cold War with people who use brainwashing methods, Puharich suddenly becomes a hot ticket item. He's talking about using the human brain and the powers of the brain to do all sorts of horrible things to people. He brings together 9 people in a seance. Now, it doesn't make a lot of sense when you realize who these people are. One of them is Arthur Young. Some of you may have heard of Arthur Young. He wrote a lot of very well-received books, The Reflexive Universe, The Geometry of Meaning. Arthur Young was a great guy. He was the inventor of the Bell helicopter. He sold his rights and all of that. He left military engineering, military development at the end of World War II in order to pursue full-time his interest in the paranormal. He studied yoga, Eastern religions, ESP, psychokinesis, astrology, you name it, he was into it, Arthur Young. his wife, Ruth Forbes Payne Young. She was also at the seance. So we have Arthur Young, the inventor of the Bell helicopter, the guy who created the Bell helicopter along with Larry Bell, his partner. We have his wife, the excessively nomenclatured Ruth Forbes Payne Young. That's all her husband. So she's married first to a Forbes. John Kerry, our presidential candidate, was a Forbes. This is a very old, very famous family. She was married to George Lyman Payne. Payne was a direct descendant of one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and related, coincidentally, to an actor called Robert Treat Payne. Long story. But anyway, Ruth Forbes, also married to a Payne, also married to Arthur Young. Not at the same time, one after the other. She has a son, Michael Payne, who then gets a job at Bell Aerospace through Arthur Young's influence, because Arthur Young helped create the company. Her son needs a job. He gets him a job at Bell Aerospace in Texas. Her best friend is Mary Bancroft. Mary Bancroft was the longtime mistress of Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles, as you know, was a famous head of the CIA, the one that Jack Kennedy fired over the Bay of Pigs when he told Dulles he was going to split the CIA into 1 million pieces. Allen Dulles was the one who was fired by Kennedy and who later wound up on the Warren Commission investigating Kennedy's death, very conveniently. So these are two people, 2 of the 9. So Michael Payne's boss, right? The boss of Michael Payne, Arthur Young's son-in-law, is none other than General Walter Dornberger. So Michael Payne has these direct connections right back to Paperclip, back to the space program. Michael Payne's wife is also named Ruth. She's Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne is a Quaker. She likes folk dancing, walks on the beach, candlelit dinners, and the Russian language. Here is a woman called Marguerite Oswald. Here is Marina Oswald. The picture was taken on November 22nd, 1963, the day that Kennedy was assassinated. That evening, they're photographed in Ruth Payne's living room in Irving, Texas. It was Ruth Payne who got Lee Harvey Oswald a job at the Texas School Book Depository, right on the route where he would be able to assassinate the president. That's Ruth Payne. Ruth Payne had visited Arthur Young and her mother-in-law, Ruth Forbes Payne Young, in Philadelphia in September of 1963. She had Marina Oswald, this Russian defector, the wife of Lee Harvey Oswald, and her children living with her in her house. What was she talking about to Arthur Young, I wonder? Did she ever mention the fact that, hey, I got this Russian defector and his wife living with me in Irving, Texas, Lee Oswald? Maybe you heard of him. He was a Marine. He defected to the Soviet Union, wanting to become a Russian citizen. He redefected back to the United States. He did all of this, and the guy's still only 24 years old. That's pretty good for a 24-year-old. A Marine, somebody involved in the Atsugi Air Base in radar technicians, a guy who spoke Russian fluently enough that his Russian-born wife thought he was Russian. Russian is a damn hard language to learn. And yet this young kid, with hardly any formal education, just barely got out of high school, joins the Marines and learns to speak fluent Russian like that, so much that he can convince Marina that he's fluent, that he's a native Russian. So Marina Oswald, the niece at NKVD, an Army military intelligence officer, marries Lee Harvey Oswald, this Marine defector, very famous defector, and they decide to go back to the United States. Ruth Payne wants to learn Russian. That's her story. Oh, I'd love to learn Russian from Marina Oswald. So she gives her some room in her house because they're broke, and then Lee goes to Texas, and, well, the rest is history. So here's the 9. Here's the connection of these 9 people. I didn't mention all the people of the 9. We'll get to that, but they're mostly DuPonts, Astors, Forbes, etc. These are the wealthiest families in the United States at the time, blue blood Americans with long pedigrees going back to the Mayflower or to the Declaration of Independence in some cases. Representatives of these families were at this bizarre seance. And during this seance in Maine, they were contacted, according to all the published documentation. I'm not making this stuff up and I'm not speculating. Puharich himself published this documentation, saying that aliens, a group of 9, contacted the group of 9 who were at this seance and said, we are 9, you are 9, we're giving you the mission, to help transform life on the planet. And what was their first major contribution was, having to do with the assassination of President Kennedy. So this 9 to me is very strange. We have to ask ourselves a lot of questions. Did that somehow promote, evolution on this planet, or did that do just the opposite? So there's Arthur Young. There's his daughter-in-law, Ruth Paine, Lee Harvey Oswald to Kennedy. The connections are very tight. And another member of the 9, of course, was an Astor, as I mentioned, Ava Alice Muriel Astor. So all American aristocracy. What does all this have to do with what we're talking about? Okay, in New Orleans, before the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald gets a job with the William Riley Coffee Company. That coffee company still exists. He went down there to get a job. He worked for a short time. He quits. He tells a coworker, hey, I've just found the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, according to the quotation. He's getting a job at NASA. Well, in 1957, the Russians sent up a Sputnik, and that scared the hell out of the American military establishment. It scared the hell out of the American people. They said, we have all these Nazi scientists, what are we getting for our, what bang for the buck are we getting here? So we have to do something about this. And so they put the fear of God into the Nazi scientists and said, okay, listen guys, enough is enough, we fooled around enough, now we have to actually do something. And so the government took control of the space program away from the military and gave it to a civilian organization, NASA. The problem with that was they moved the Nazi scientists from the military to NASA. So it was a change in name only. Suddenly you have military scientists who were Nazis, who were true believers. Now they're working for a civilian agency for NASA under the US government. We didn't really change anything. Direct military control was lost, but the Nazis were still in command. After the assassination, Lee Harvey Oswald leaves the William Riley Coffee Company. He never does work for NASA, although we find out that he was probably working out of an office at the NASA site that was an employment agency for the CIA. This is something that's also come up recently. Anyway, he leaves William Riley. He leaves New Orleans, goes to Texas. After the assassination, his co-workers also all get jobs at NASA. At NASA. They're coffee company clerks, and they got jobs at NASA. As I mentioned, Ruth Paine had visited his wife, visits Arthur Young and his wife. Arthur Young believes, or he's been told, that he's been in contact with these 9 supernatural beings. Andrija Puharich, the guy who organizes this, the captain in the army involved in weaponizing the paranormal, he's the guy who discovers Uri Geller, the Israeli psychic who bends spoons by looking at them. He brings Uri Geller to the United States. He gets him involved with the Sanford Research Institute, run by Scientologists, as it turns out. All this other stuff is going on. Uri Geller eventually says he got tired of it. He thought that he was being run by Puharich as an intelligence asset. He really felt that Puharich was an intelligence agent running him as an agent for one of the intelligence agencies. But part of that program was that he felt from time to time he was being put in contact with extraterrestrial beings. Geller was mystified by what was going on in his brain by all of this. Now, whether you think about Uri Geller as being genuine or not, or a player or not, or whatever, Geller is pretty open and honest about his relationship with Puharich. He didn't like him, he distrusted him, and eventually he cut off relations with him. So then in New Orleans, after the assassination, Garrison remembers David Ferrie, Jack Martin, all these guys, Guy Bannister. He conducts his own investigation. And he finds that all of these guys were bishops in a church, except for Guy Bannister, who was like the Pope or something, of the Vatican in New Orleans. And then Guy Bannister and Fred Krisman were the guys who jump-started the UFO thing in 1947 after Kenneth Arnold. So he calls in Fred Krisman. Guy Bannister is dead. He died in 1964, again mysteriously. So what was the secret space program? In 1947, we had the famous Roswell incident. The Roswell debris, we know, is taken to Wright Air Force Base, eventually Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field at the time, which is the same place where we bring Walter Dornberger, Wernher von Braun, and everybody else preliminarily. We bring them all together. All these guys are together in 1947 in one place. At the same time, we have all these UFO sightings. We have Nazi scientists in the space program. We're afraid the Russians have the bomb. As it turns out, a lot of people had to bomb in those days. We have a group of wealthy Americans all involved in the militarization of the paranormal. And they make this contact with this extraterrestrial group called the Nine. I wrote a book called Sinister Forces. The very first volume is called The Nine. And it focuses on this strange bit of connections. We have this family, this group of families having a seance in 1952 in Maine, talking to aliens in a spaceship hovering over the Earth, they say. And then later we find tendrils leading out from that seance directly to the Kennedy assassination, among other things. But the Kennedy assassination being the most important and the most obvious one. If you follow the Kennedy assassination, you may know of a guy called George de Mohrenschildt. He was a Russian CIA contract agent who eventually helped in some way Lee Harvey Oswald and Marina. He was involved with them. He commits suicide before he has to give an interview about all of this. I mean, Lee Harvey Oswald was surrounded by so many bishops and so many members of the Nine, the poor guy had no chance, you know. I mean, he was basically surrounded by people who all felt they had some sort of mysterious mission, and Lee Harvey Oswald was the guy in the middle. Oswald himself didn't have much of a connection this way. Connection to military intelligence, probably. That fluency in Russian should tip you off right away in those days. But the rest of the connections to the Nine, to the assassinations before and since, are incredible. They're astonishing. We know the CIA was blamed for the Kennedy assassination. We've all heard the stories. But what we don't really realize is the CIA, at the time of the assassination, for instance, was heavily involved with another Nazi organization, the Gehlen organization, which was running agents for the CIA in Eastern Europe and against the Soviet Union. Again, just like in Paperclip, these Nazi scientists were not really working for us. They were taking our money, they were giving us phony reports. They were virtually useless against us. Allen Dulles was protecting Nazi war criminals since before the war ended. We know that in transcripts of speeches and talks that he had with famous Nazi leaders going back to 1944 and 1945. And the fascinating thing about Allen Dulles, bringing all of these pieces of these disparate things together, was that he was Mary Bancroft's mistress. Okay, Mary Bancroft was the friend of Ruth Forbes Payne Young. During the Warren Commission interviews with witnesses, and you can read this in the Warren Commission transcripts, look for Ruth Payne. Read her, she appeared twice before the commission, talking about what she was doing in the days and weeks and months leading up to the assassination, how she knew Lee and Marina Oswald, all of these questions. Allen Dulles is part of that committee. He's sitting in. At the point where Ruth Payne starts to talk about her trip to Philadelphia to meet Arthur Young 2 months before the assassination, 3 months before the assassination, Allen Dulles cuts her off and changes the subject. He does not allow her to finish the story. Read the transcript for yourself, you'll see it. It's blatant. Allen Dulles, who's been quiet the entire time, suddenly jumps in, you know, like a defense attorney, and then suddenly says, oh no, we're not going to, you know, let's talk about this instead. As she's about to say who she met, who she was dealing with, Allen Dulles changes the subject, changes the story. Her information about Arthur Young never makes it into the record, and she hasn't talked about it since. So what do we have? We have a Garrison investigation alleging there was a conspiracy in the Kennedy assassination. The problem with Garrison trying to prove all of this is that he had a cast of characters nobody would believe, right? He had Clay Shaw, who was an unbelievable character on his own, the man that he was trying for the assassination. But he also had all these other characters. He had all these bishops, you know? He didn't know what to do with these bishops. He couldn't understand that the bishops were a front for an intelligence operation. He suspected it, but he didn't know where to go with it. Paranormal researchers, UFO personalities like Guy Bannister, like Fred Krisman, and of course employees of NASA. All of these people can be tied back to Paperclip, can be tied back to the Nazi space program, the people that we brought over. The history of the last 100 years is largely still classified. We live in a kind of dream world, thinking that we know what actually happened, right? Then we have to go back and say, wait a minute, what really happened? If we talk about Paperclip, the way I was taught in school in the 1950s and 60s was that the Nazis were these were good Germans. Werner von Braun was never a Nazi. Dornberger was never a Nazi. All these guys were on our side. As it turns out, it wasn't true. As it turns out, they were sabotaging us every step of the way. Our space program was the result of Nazis trying to stonewall us and to prevent us from getting there, until eventually, after Sputnik, they were told, you better do it or get out. So that's what happened. We sold our soul in the United States, and not just the United States, believe me, other countries as well, including the Soviet Union. We sold our soul for this technology. We dealt with some of the worst war criminals in history. Not just even the Holocaust, but the idea that they had slave labor that they worked to death and replaced with other slave laborers. And these people who employed these slave laborers deliberately, who were involved in every step of that process, including the killing of these laborers also, were the people that we brought over for the space program. Our space program has its origins in people, on the one hand, like Jack Parsons, who once wrote that he was the Antichrist. He was a brilliant man, but he believed he was the Antichrist and was ushering in a new age of witchcraft, according to him. And he was a follower of Crowley and member of the Ordo Templi Orientis and all of this, a very brilliant guy, but a very strange guy, on the one hand, and we had the Nazis on the other. You know, these were the people that were jump-starting the space program of the United States, starting in 1936 and going up until the moon launch. So we have to go back and relook at this history and ask ourselves why. Why was it so necessary? Why was the space program militarily necessary? Why did they work for the Army? Why did they sabotage the process as much as they could? Why did the Army allow Nazi scientists to wander off the base and do whatever they wanted to do? So we have to reevaluate the history of the world since 1945. We have to go back and look at it again. If we want to know what happened, what's going on with the space program, and about breakaway civilizations, about motivations to create a space program for the rich and the powerful. Who benefited, right? Civilian control of NASA began in 1957. The Nazi scientists remained in place. They were there at the very beginning of the UFO era. Many people believe the Nazis had developed the very first prototypes of the flying saucer, of wingless aircraft, of alternate energy, of the atomic bomb. The Luftwaffe had a map of Manhattan in which they were trying to estimate the damage an atomic bomb would have and how many people would be killed. This map was developed in 1943. Something else was going on. What they told us was not the way it happened. And now my fear is, in the United States, because we have the Patriot Act and because we have all sorts of ways to stifle inquiry, to stop information from getting out, more secrets can be kept, more programs can be instituted about which we will know nothing until it's too late. Kennedy was perceived as a threat to the program. He had signed treaties with the Soviets, promised not to invade Cuba. This was against the Nazi ideology. This was contrary to a Nazi platform, not an American platform. Kennedy was a very popular president, you know. But his idea of cutting a deal with the Soviets and essentially saving the world from thermonuclear war in 1962 was disregarded because many in the military thought we should have gone to war. What more was there at stake? Why was Kennedy killed? It had to be for some really big reason. It couldn't be because they didn't like his hair, you know. It had to be for something really specific and something big, something major, something that was going to affect the economy and the political structure, power structures that existed. So was there, in the 1960s, a secret space program? We talk a lot about the military-industrial complex. President Eisenhower warned us about that in his farewell address when he left office. And we've focused on that to a great deal, but we don't really know what it is. We know it has to do with guns and the Army. But remember that the military also was developing rockets, jet propulsion, various types of missiles. NASA was solely occupied with visiting other planets, according to its brief. Its space science was satellites going to other planets. It was a non-military application of space technology. The military was still involved in their own aspects of space technology. And this involved missiles, it involved alternate sources of energy, it involved different types of aircraft that could fly at tremendous speeds. And Area 51, according to popular understanding was a military installation, a military base. That's not exactly true. It was an intelligence operation. It had nothing really to do directly with the military. It was an indirect relationship that was had at Area 51. So you had the development of the U-2. People, of course, always say they were back engineering, reverse engineering spacecraft or UFOs and that sort of thing there. This guy would not talk about that, of course. He poo-pooed the idea. But his presentation began with a picture of an alien and the theme song from the X-Files. Right. So he starts his presentation this way, and of course everybody laughs politely or nervously. So he went into a lot of detail about what happened up there and how we lost more of our CIA agents in a single accident involving Area 51 than we ever lost in the field. So there was a lot going on up there, and that's still classified. He still can't really talk about it, not even to a group of former intelligence officers who had all signed secrecy oaths and everything else, and he still couldn't go into it. So his presentation was rather thin. But he did talk about the U-2 programs and Francis Gary Powers and all of that, and everybody in the audience understood that when he's talking about Francis Gary Powers, the pilot of the U-2 who was shot down over the Soviet Union, we're also talking about Lee Harvey Oswald. We're also talking about Oswald's involvement with that particular part of the space program, because Oswald was stationed, as we know, at Tsugi Air Force Base in Japan, which was one of only 2 bases in the world at which the U-2 would take off from. That was the base where it was kept. So the flights from Japan went over the Soviet Union, and Oswald's job as a radar operator was in the room with the traffic controllers that were sending up the U-2s. So every time we turn around in these major political events, we run across the space program again in some way, shape, or form. It was insidious. It involved all sorts of aspects of American life, things that we would never expect. Why did people who worked at Riley Coffee Company all go to work for NASA? Why did Oswald claim that he was getting a job at NASA? Why did all these other spooks and all these other strange people wind up somehow with the space program and then again with the Kennedy assassination? There is something very serious going on here. If you look at the space programs in Europe, if you look at the space programs in China and other parts of the world, you will see all the connections going back to this one central phenomenon of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. And you have to ask yourself, was it really a space race? Politicians on both sides may have thought it was a race. Low-level politicians may have thought this. They may have been stricken with fear that we were in a race against the Russians for domination of space. We may have thought this. But the scientists on either side, I think, never had any illusions about this. There was no race. There was a cooperation. Someone at some point decided the Soviets can go first. They'll have their Sputnik, and they'll send a dog into space, and then eventually they will send an astronaut into space. The Russians had the first go at it. How could they possibly? When we had the creme de la creme, when we had all of the best and the brightest of the Nazi space program. How did that happen? It had to have been a cooperation between the scientists themselves. And this is what we have in the space program. They cooperated so much that people died. People were killed. People were assassinated. Serious investigations into the UFOs led to the deaths of a lot of people. James McDonald, famous scientist who went before Congress and insisted that the UFO sightings were not the result of sightings of the planet Venus, swamp gas, or weather balloons. For this, he was ridiculed. He was later found dead. They said he committed suicide. They always say they committed suicide. That's the standard response. Murray Jessup, right, involved in the Philadelphia experiment stuff and a researcher into UFOs and all of that, commits suicide, they say, in Miami, Florida. All of these people who are seriously involved in this study, who try to promote it, who try to talk reasonably about it. Not wild-eyed, aluminum foil hat wearing people, talking that their minds are being controlled from Venus or something. These are serious people. James McDonald was a very serious guy. He was a scientist. He was a doctor, a PhD, a meteorologist. He knew what he was talking about. Dead. So we have these things connected with the UFO program. Why? If the UFO phenomenon is a figment of our imaginations, if we're projecting stuff onto atmospheric conditions and we're seeing ghosts or something like that, why all of this secrecy? Why all the murder? Why all the suicides? What does that have to do with just believing in 6 impossible things before breakfast. There's something very serious, something that points to people who are willing to spill blood in the furtherance of a goal or an objective. And the best example we have of that in the last 100 years has been, of course, the Nazis and the SS. People who thought that to kill huge numbers of people was justified for a kind of spiritual reason. The Nazis believed very seriously, this was not propaganda, they believed very seriously in the idea that in the blood is the spirit. They believed that your race carried a spiritual component and that those of inferior races, quote unquote, were inferior spiritually, so it was okay to kill them. In fact, it was necessary to kill them to purify the rest of the planet, to purify the race. This was something they believed very sincerely. And they looked to American scientists who came up with this idea in something called eugenics and the race science program. So, when you have people who believe that the ends justify the means, when you have people who believe that murder is acceptable, even on a huge scale, because of the responsibility they have to jumpstart evolution, the next stage of it, and then they lose a war, do you really think they're going to go away? Do you really think they're going to say, shucks, lost the war, I guess we're all going to become Democrats? You know, it's not going to happen. It just won't happen. Of Christianity. Christianity began and lived underground, in cemeteries, in catacombs, meeting secretly at night for over 300 years before it was accepted in the Roman Empire. 300 years. These people who believed in a kind of an impossible thing, a resurrected person, right? They kept on to that belief for 300 years. The Nazis lost their war in 1945, right? 65, 66 years ago. That's not a long time. You know. Some of them are still alive. Some of these people are still alive and they're still having influence in their own countries. They're having influence as far away as Australia. They're all over the place, you know. And as they die off, they have people who are following in their footsteps, people they've talked to, indoctrinated. They don't go away. This is a cult that does not disappear. The problem with this particular cult is that they're very well funded, and they have a lot of supporters in a lot of countries. The presence of Nazis and neo-Nazis in this world, in general, is growing. It's not going away. So, when we talk about a secret space program, as I've said before, why wouldn't there be a secret space program? Why wouldn't there be? We have a lot of people here. We're afraid of certain things, and the people with power are afraid of something else. The people with power are afraid this planet may become uninhabitable soon. They're afraid there may be wars over water. There may be wars over clean air. Whether or not you believe in global warming, whether or not you believe it was created by humans or not the issue. The people in charge, they won't tell you this, but they do believe in global warming. They do believe that the planet is gradually becoming less and less inhabitable. So there would be a secret space program. There would be a program to get as many of their people off planet as possible. Some of them are reptiles. If the government can keep secrets, as they did with the space program, as they did with Paperclip, as they did with the assassinations, as they did with Admiral Byrd's diaries, for crying out loud. This was his concept. He said there should be a people's CIA, you know, to work against the other CIA. We should be collecting our own information. Well, things like WikiLeaks have made this possible, right? The internet has made this possible. We have the information available to us. We can start digging. People do come out of the woodwork. They do start spilling their guts, you know. There are people who are close to what's going on, who have a little piece of information, and they're willing to share it. And these people, when you put these pieces together, you can start to see what's really going on. And in the secret space programs that we're talking about, we'll continue to talk about today, you're going to hear about a lot of secrecy. You're going to hear about a lot of suggestions for new types of technology that have been going on. We know that technologies exist, for instance, that would give us free energy, or close to free energy. And they've been in existence for a long time. We can't get access to that, you know, because of government policies, because of secrecy, because of classified documents, because of the opposition by corporations. So our lives are on the line, you know, because of these policies that are taken, these positions that are taken. And they're not taken by you and me. They're not taken by people in general. It's not all of us getting together and saying, why, no, we shouldn't have free energy, that's horrible. None of us would agree to that. And yet we have to accept it. Jewish organizations wrote letters complaining to Truman, wrote letters complaining to the Pentagon about bringing Nazi scientists to the United States. Truman was on their side. Truman forbade the Pentagon from bringing Nazis to the United States. He said, no, we will not do this. This barters our soul. You can't possibly cut deals with these murderers. The Pentagon ignored him. That's how much power the president has, right? All the Nazis. We're talking thousands that were brought over. Not a few hundred, as normally the history books will tell you. Many more than that. And the paperclip program went all the way through the 1960s, boys and girls. It wasn't just the 1940s or even the 1950s. It went all the way up to 1960 and beyond. We were bringing scientists over that late, wherever we could find them, giving them jobs, setting them up. They became wealthy in many cases. Von Braun did, Dornberger did, as they were plotting to kill political leaders and doing all sorts of other things. We gave them a lot of work and a lot of money, This is the information that we need in order to make decisions about who we're supporting, what programs we support, what policies we support. We don't know enough to make these decisions yet because we've been lied to for so long. I don't deny what people like the WikiLeaks founder was doing, or the people who are blowing the whistle to WikiLeaks, actually. Are all these people going on the line and saying, here's what's really going on, here are the memos, here's the real history of the world being told in these memos. Don't deny their sacrifice. They are trying to get this word out. They're trying to make every one of us aware of what's really going on. It makes for very sad reading, of course. Some of it is chilling. Some of it is just depressing. But we need to know. Think about the assassination of Kennedy because it brings all of these elements together in very unusual ways. Think about the weird churches that were involved because we know more about them today than we knew even 10 years ago or 20 years ago. These churches are still involved. They were involved in Iran-Contra. They were involved in the former Yugoslavia, in all of the fighting that was going on there. Church leaders, their names are connected to all of this. They're still running operations. It's still a covert ops organization. The American Orthodox Catholic Church, you'll find them everywhere. And they're running agents all sorts of places. Not everyone is an agent. Some of them are very sincere people, but not many. So keep an eye on that. Keep an eye on what's going on. When a name shows up in one news story that had showed up in one 5 years ago that you remember, pay attention. When these things happen, when these so-called coincidences take place, that's when you realize there's the action of what I call the sinister forces at work. So if you pay attention, you will learn something. It'll make you a little nervous, it'll make you a little fearful, but it will be real information. It will be something you can really know and use and understand.
NASA, billions of dollars, Freemasons, you swear to God? The LRO, as it is
There are some troublous times coming, folks, in the very near future. There have been more Christians killed in the last 100 years than in the last 1,000 years before that. There's a real persecution of Christians going on all across this planet. It hasn't hit America very bad yet, but it's coming, folks. Folks, evolution is not just a dumb idea. It's a dangerous philosophy. There's a real battle going on, and some people don't even comprehend what's happening. Things that kids have to face every day that are simply not true. They're being lied to. I mean, there's no kind way to say it. James Hutton, back in the late 1700s, started the idea in modern society that the earth is billions of years old. James Hutton's book influenced a young lawyer named Sir Charles Lyell, and Charles Lyell wrote this book in 1830. There were a variety of people involved in this. It's hard to pin it on one person, but Charles Lyell certainly has to be one of the key players responsible for bringing us the evolution theory. He's the guy who invented the geologic column, which you kids have to study in school, and the geologic column does not exist in the world except in the textbooks. We covered video number 4. We covered all about the geologic column. This fellow says, I myself have little doubt that in England it was the long-age uniformitarian geology and the theory of evolution that changed us from a Christian to a pagan nation. And by the way, England today is a pagan nation. America is also a pagan nation. Charles Darwin, who wrote the book Origin of Species, and there's more to the title, we'll cover that in a minute, he was strongly influenced by quite a few folks. He was influenced by Lyell. He was influenced by a guy named Malthus. Now, Malthus had written a book saying, there are more people born than can possibly survive. So it's best if the weaker die off. Well, Darwin read that and believed it and said, wow, well then, okay, that goes along with my theory of evolution. James Hutton's book came out in 1795. Charles Lyell took away the flood, and his book came out in 1830. Darwin's book came out in 1859, and he took away the Creator. And boy, for the next 50 years, we saw the rise of all sorts of interesting philosophies. After all, if there is no God, well then, we must be God. And that led immediately to the rise of communism, socialism, Marxism, and the New World Order. Fred Hoyle, a famous British astrophysicist, said, I am haunted by a conviction that the nihilistic philosophy, which so-called educated opinion chose to adopt following the publication of The Origin of Species, committed mankind to a course of automatic self-destruction. A doomsday was then set ticking. See, there are 4 great questions and 2 ways to answer them. Who am I? Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going when I die? Evolution tries to offer 4 answers to those 4 questions. Creation offers an answer to those questions also. See, if creation is true, there are 2 ways to look at the world. Some people look at it and say, wow, it's incredible design, there must be a designer. That's the creation worldview. Other people say, nope, just evolved all by itself. The Bible says God created the heaven and the earth, but some people are able to look at this world and say with a straight face, you know, there's amazing, it's a big bang, made this from nothing. That's the humanist worldview. See, humanists put humans in God's place. They say man is God. Humanists regard the universe as self-existing and not created. That's the first plank in the Humanist Manifesto. Evolution is the foundation for humanism. This fellow wrote a book, and in his book he said, do humanists believe in a supreme being? Emphatically, yes, that supreme being is man. Humanists have no knowledge of any being more supreme. This guy says the turning point in history will be the moment that man becomes aware that the only God of man is man himself. Now, just who owns this world anyway? People get this idea, I am God. 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 See, if evolution is true, then who owns this world? Fundamental question. Who owns the world? Who owns you? Who makes the rules? How do you decide right from wrong anyway? If evolution is true, how are kids supposed to decide right from wrong? They have no moral standard, no moral compass to go by. If man is God, and this is what humanism means, then the strongest make the rules. Might makes right. That's a natural philosophy that flows from evolution. There is no absolute standard, and there's no possible way to tell right from wrong. The problem is very simple. There's a war going on. We are in the center of the battlefield. This is the greatest war in history. There are some troublous times coming, folks, in the very near future. There have been more Christians killed in the last 100 years than in the last 1,000 years before that. There's a real persecution of Christians going on all across this planet. It hasn't hit America very bad yet, but it's coming, folks. Crawley claimed that his demon, Oasis, Iwas, told him the year 2000 would mark the end of the superstition of Christianity and the beginning of the golden age, when those possessing the will to dominate and conquer would ascend to godhood. The Satan worshippers think they're going to get to become God. But you know, they're teaching man has evolved as far as he can go physically, and next we're going to evolve spiritually, where we get to realize we are God. See, what you believe determines your behavior. Now, some people reasoned if there is no God, and if man evolved from dark-skinned apes, then the colored man must be less evolved than others. Racism has always been in the world, but I tell you what, when evolution hit the scene, racism really took off. Evolution is the foundation for racism. Notice the title to Darwin's book, The Origin of Species. Now, his book came out in 1859. Evolution came out way before that. Darwin just simply made the theory popular. Okay, and of course, racism was already in the world, but this book justified racism. They claim these monkeys are different species of monkeys. The origin of species. Well, they're still the same kind of creature. They're all the same. They're a monkey, okay? Here's more of the title. This book says, Darwin wrote a book titled On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. Oh, now that gives you a little more of the title. But let me show you the entire title. You see, back in those days, books had long titles. Here is the entire title to Darwin's book. On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. Favored races? What do you mean by that, Charlie? Do you mean one race is better than others? And it was the preachers that accepted Darwin before the scientists did. Oh, that's exactly what he meant, folks. Darwin was a racist. He thought natives were just advanced animals. Said biological arguments for racism may have been common before 1850, but they increased by orders of magnitude following the acceptance of evolutionary theory. And it was the preachers that accepted Darwin before the scientists did. This is an Anglican priest. Now see, the scientists rejected Darwin when he came out. His book was written, the scientists said, this is a stupid theory. The preachers and the priests, especially in England, accepted Darwin and started preaching Darwin from their pulpits. And it was the preachers that accepted Darwin before the scientists did. In 1859. These two folks were going around collecting skulls for museums to be displays for missing links. Here's the story the missionary said, right here. A New South Wales missionary was the horrified witness to the slaughter by mounted police of a group of dozens of Aboriginal men, women, and children. 45 heads were then boiled down, and the best 10 skulls were packed off for overseas. They shot them to get their heads for museum displays. Did you know the Smithsonian has 33,000 sets of human remains in their basement? Right now. It's called the Army of the Potomac. He believed there were inferior races also, but he thought the Indians were inferior. Our leaders really thought they were an inferior species. And if you are a racist, or you think you are superior because of the color of your skin, you are a hypocrite. If I know how to spell it, I'd spell it for you, but it starts with an H. Hypocrite, okay? Darwin also thought that women were inferior. He said a married man is a poor slave, worse than a Negro. If a professor said that today in his class, how long would he keep his job? And yet, Darwin said this, and tomorrow in school, kids are going to be taught that Darwin was a great scientist and a great man. He was a racist and a chauvinist. Darwin said, the chief distinction in intellectual powers of the two sexes is shown by man's attaining to a higher eminence in whatever he takes up than can woman. Whether requiring deep thought, reason, or imagination, or merely the use of senses and hands, the average mental power of man must be above that of woman. Darwin believed in inbreeding. He married his maternal father's granddaughter, his first cousin, who was also his mother's niece. They wanted to produce a superior stock. They had 10 children. Mary died shortly after birth. Anne died age 10. Robert was born retarded, died at 19 months. Henrietta had a serious breakdown at age 15. 3 of his 6 other sons were ill so often, Charles regarded them as semi-invalids. So much for inbreeding, Charlie. Evolution is also the foundation for communism. Wonder how many kids have gone to college and lost their faith because some professor destroyed it. 75% of kids from Christian homes who go to public schools are going to reject the Christian faith after 1 year of college. Karl Marx later said, "My objective in life is to dethrone God and destroy capitalism." Karl Marx based his philosophy of communism on evolution. He even tried to dedicate his book to Charles Darwin. Dedicated to Charles Darwin from a sincere admirer, Karl Marx, 1873. Interesting. Karl Marx had 6 children. 3 died of starvation in infancy. The guy never worked a day in his life. He's a lazy bum. That's the days before they had the little cardboard sign, you know, "We'll work for food." He didn't even hold up the sign, okay? 2 other kids committed suicide. When Marx died, only 6 people attended his funeral. He was a loser all the way around. But Karl Marx left a legacy. He left us the Communist Manifesto of 1848. There are 10 planks to the Communist Manifesto. All of them are based on anything that is anti-Christian. If God's for it, Marx was against it. The first plank was to abolish private property. The president of the National Audubon Society said, "We reject the idea of private property." Be governed. One is based upon evolution thinking, which says laws come from man's opinion. After all, if there is no God, then we must be it, folks. We better decide what's right and wrong. Rights are granted by the government, and the government should be the provider. Government should provide everything. That's really based on evolution thinking. It's called a democracy. And democracies are terrible forms of government. They said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights." Hey, where do rights come from? They come from the Creator. Do you have the right to get married? Yeah. Where does this right come from? From God. Well, then why do we ask the state for permission? A lot of folks don't understand, but if you get a state marriage license, you've now entered into a contract between you and your husband or wife and the state you live in, and any children you produce belong to the state. And they can come take them away if they don't like the way you're raising them. And it all starts with that marriage contract. There was no such thing as a marriage license till about 100 years ago. Listen to the preacher. It makes me nervous when I hear him say that. "By the authority invested in me by the state of Wisconsin," and now pronounce you man and wife? Now, you want to study that subject out real carefully. Get the website hushmoney.com or .org. You can get a lot more on that. Hushmoney.com, here it is. Others add that creation is true, and laws come from the Creator, rights are unalienable, and the government should be limited to 2 things: punish evildoers and defend us from outside invaders. Those are the only 2 legitimate functions of government. And all the basic philosophies of government are really based on creation or evolution. Second plank in Karl Marx's manifesto was a heavy progressive income tax. Okay? The third one was abolish the rights of inheritance. Number 4, confiscate property rights. Number 5, a central bank. Remember, love of money, root of all evil. 1913, we got a creature from Jekyll Island, Georgia, called the Federal Reserve. You ought to read that book and find the history behind the Federal Reserve. Nothing federal about it, and there are no reserves. It's no more federal than the Federal Express. For centuries, the alchemists sought for ways to turn lead into gold. They failed. But the bankers discovered a way to do it. Start wars and finance both sides. Interesting. After the lead stops flying, the gold rolls in as interest payments on the national debt. Did you know during World War II, U.S. debt rose almost 600%, Japanese debt rose 1,300%, French debt rose almost 600%, Canadian debt rose 400%. Debt to who? Who do we owe this money to? What's the national debt now? Like 17 trillion when they're really honest and put all the numbers on the table? Who do we owe this money to? Every one of you is carrying in your wallet or your purse evidence of our debt. You want to see it? This is not a $5 bill. This is a debt note. This is proof of our debt. Federal Reserve note. This is not money, folks. That'd take a long time to explain all that, but the national debt is absolutely staggering. I'm afraid we've got our sons and grandsons and great-grandsons in debt already right now, folks. Here's to give you a little bit of the history of the love of money and how this ties in. Okay? In 1776, we fought a war with England and gained independence from England and from the Bank of England. Only Congress had power to coin money. Jefferson warned if the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of currency, by the way, Federal Reserves are private banks. Okay? First by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that grow up around them will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. In 1792, Alexander Hamilton established a 20-year charter with the Bank of England. Big mistake, Alex. In 1812, renewal was denied and war broke out. England said, okay, charter's up, we want the colonies back. That's what the War of 1812 was really about. Okay? 1833, Andrew Jackson removed all money from the chartered banks and put them into state banks. In 1836, the rich men, the Rockefellers, Rothschilds, these kind of guys, had Mexico invade Texas, started a war to punish America for not keeping their money in his banks. In 1861, these same rich men helped create the Civil War to disrupt the economy. They wanted to create debt and get their power back. In 1861, the Industrial Revolution created great wealth in the hands of a few. You ought to read the book, The Robber Barons, for more on that. In 1907, banker J.P. Morgan deliberately created the financial panic to promote the idea of a central bank. In 1912, the communist, Marxist, Colonel House, who was Wilson's alter ego, he was in the Wilson administration, he wrote a book called Philip Drew, Administrator, to explain his conspiracy to establish a central bank and create a progressive income tax. 1913, Federal Reserve Act was passed and Federal Income Tax Act was passed. December 23rd, 2 days before Christmas, the Federal Reserve Act passed. Then the 16th Amendment was passed. Now this is the greatest hoax in history. All the senators had gone home. This is Christmas. Colonel House walks in, announces to practically an empty Senate, the 16th Amendment has passed. Now when an amendment passes, all the states have to ratify it. When this 16th Amendment to allow for the income tax went out to all the different states, almost every state didn't even vote on it. When it came up for issue, they said, this is unconstitutional. We passed. We're not going to vote on it. So when they said passed, that didn't mean they agreed. That means they didn't want to vote on it. 16th Amendment was never ratified. The law that never was, okay? In 1916, Wilson, reflecting on the Federal Reserve Act, said, I have unwittingly ruined my country. From 1920 to 1929, the bankers increased the money supply by 62% to create the Roaring Twenties and brought people into the stock market. October 1929, the bankers called in their loans and sent the economy into the Great Depression. This was intentionally done. And then helped create the New Deal programs where they could loan the government money to rescue the economy. And guess who we're in debt to? Same guys. In June 1932, Congressman Louis McFadden gave his powerful speech to Congress spelling out who had caused the Depression. On the third try, they finally had him assassinated. Congressman Louis McFadden. There was also, Lindbergh was very much outspoken against the banking system, and he ended up getting his baby kidnapped and murdered because of this same issue. Okay? 1933, the government debt to the bankers began to grow steadily. Millions readily accepted a Social Security number, which, by the way, is voluntary, and I don't have one. Okay? The rich men then tricked people into getting a Social Security number in order to get their benefits from the government. As usual, they created a crisis, the Depression, to encourage compliance. Here's an original Social Security card. Look what it says. Not for identification. New ones, you have to have for identification for just about everything, don't you? Go to the local post office and pick up a draft notice for you kids, selective service. Look what it says here. If you have a Social Security number, it is mandatory you include this information. If you don't have one, leave this block blank. It is not mandatory to have a Social Security number. They want you to think it is, but it is totally voluntary. What happened, we traded our real money, which is silver and gold, for worthless paper. Real soon, those who control the real money will require all transactions to be controlled electronically by an embedded chip. I have in my wallet a $5 Federal Reserve note from 1928. Very interesting reading. Look what it says here. Redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury, or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. What are they telling me? I can trade this in for gold, or I can trade it in for lawful money. Isn't that what it says? You mean this is not lawful money? No, this is a Federal Reserve note. This is a debt note. This is not money. We've got a whole generation now who grows up thinking this is money, and it is not money, folks. It is a note. It's a debt note. Then in 1933, a couple of years after this was issued, President Roosevelt declared to Congress of Governors that a national state of emergency existed. The Great Depression was going on. So the governors voted unanimously to give the president emergency power to wage war on the economy. These powers would not be available under normal constitutional process. March 1933, Congress voted to give the President of the United States and to the Secretary of the Treasury the emergency powers sanctioned to wage war through executive orders. Abraham Lincoln issued the first executive order to bring troops into the South. And by the way, I love my country, but the wrong side won that war. That war was not about slavery. That war was about states' rights. 1933, Section 5B of the Trading with the Enemy Act of 1917 was amended to include the citizens of the United States. By the way, capital U, capital S, you don't want to be a citizen of that one. You want to be a citizen of the small u, capital S. That's another long, interesting story. Okay? By and through their ability to own gold and silver as an enemy of the United States. In 1933, they said if you own gold, you're an enemy of the country. Everybody turned their gold in to the government. 1933. Then in 1934, this note was issued, which I have in my collection at home. It says right here, this note is legal tender for all debts, public and private, and is redeemable in lawful money at the United States Treasury or at any Federal Reserve Bank. That's still not lawful money, folks. It's fraudulent. See, the note is evidence of debt, not money. The Coinage Act of 1792, which has never been revoked, defines a dollar as 25.8 grains of gold or 412 grains of silver. That's why a silver dollar was always the same size. It had to be 90% silver and had to weigh a certain amount. And it was a real lawful dollar. Here's the new euro currency. European Common Market. Interesting. Notice the woman riding on the beast here in both the coins and the dollars. Revelation 17. He carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-colored beast, full of names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. The beast has 7 heads and 10 horns on the European currency. Interesting. Here's the Bank of England 10-pound note with Charles Darwin's picture on there. Now that's interesting. You know, Khrushchev used to brag that he got all of his secrets from Rockefeller's CIA. By the way, the CIA was not a government organization. It was a private organization. Basically, they took away our gold and gave us paper. Federal Reserve notes. Next, they're going to take away the paper and give us plastic. where you have to have a record of the transaction. There's no record of a paper transaction. Now with computers, there can be a record of every transaction that's made. Finally, they're going to take away the plastic and put a mark in the hand or forehead. Coming soon. In Pensacola, a couple years ago, they had a festival. Cash was not allowed. You could not spend money, or Federal Reserve notes. You had to have a card. I know in Washington, D.C., you cannot ride the bus or the transit system unless you have a card in your wallet, which has a microchip embedded in it. And you don't even take it out of your wallet. You step up on the bus and you walk through this little archway and automatically deducts the fare from your card. There are places where you can recharge your card all around the city. But if you don't have a card, you don't ride the bus. And it will get to the point where if you don't have a chip in your hand or your forehead, you don't go in the store. Or you don't buy or sell with this microchip technology. They now have these little tiny chips. Hitachi Corporation, just a few weeks ago, or a couple months ago, came out with the Mu chip. 1/2 millimeter. The size of a period on a piece of paper. Well, that's interesting. That's also going to make it kind of easy to track people that the government's looking for, isn't it? They always create a crisis to get people to accept this new idea. That's how the Social Security got in. Mondex Corporation, Mon for monetary and Dex for Dexter. Monetary means pertaining to money. Dexter means belonging to or located on the right hand. MasterCard has 51% ownership of Mondex. One of the folks from Mondex, Robin Kelly, said, "This is the final stage in becoming a global reality," said Robin Kelly of Mondex International. "With MasterCard's backing, there's nothing to stop Mondex from becoming the global standard." Watch for smart cards, okay? They use the SET technology, which stands for Secure Electronic Transaction. By the way, Set is the Egyptian god of evil. The SET mark. AT&T and Lucent Technologies purchased the franchise from Mondex USA. Their logo is the symbol of the solar serpent, or the red dragon, who is Satan. That's Lucifer Technologies, Lucent Technologies. Lucent is compound of Lucifer Enterprises. They seem to be quite flagrant in naming their products Styx, S-T-Y-X, that's a river in Hades. Janus, the two-faced god. Inferno, promoted with a quote from the Inferno, a story about Lucifer in the bowels of hell. This company deliberately, this is what I heard, chose to move their offices to 666 Fifth Avenue, Manhattan. Karl Marx, though, in his plank number 6, said you need government ownership of transportation. When a car is manufactured, it gets a certificate of origin, or a manufacturer's certificate of origin, MSO. When it's brought into the state keeps that MSO in their files and issues a certificate of title. And so when you buy a new car, you don't really own the car, the state owns the car. You have to pay every year to keep a license plate on that car, don't you? But if you pay for the car from the dealer and you pay for it with gold or silver, real money, then you can get the manufacturer certificate of origin, MSO, and now you don't ever need license plates. Because you really actually own the car. That's another long, interesting story. Enough said. Do some research. You'll find out I'm telling the truth. Okay. Number 7, government ownership of factories and agriculture. Number 8, government control of labor. Number 9, corporate farms and regional planning. Number 10, free education. Did you know the free public school idea was Karl Marx's plan? Hitler said, you let me control the textbooks, I'll control the state. United Nations, World Declaration on Education for All, called for all the nations of the world to adopt a common education system complete with implementation, timetables, and recommended curriculum. In our own nation, Goals 2000, School to Work, and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, Profiles of Learning, now before Congress, are totally consistent with the One World Government recommendations of the UN Declaration. It said, the battle for humankind's future must be waged and won in the public school classroom by teachers who correctly perceive their role as proselytizers of a new faith which will replace the rotting corpse of Christianity. This guy said every child who enters school at age 5 is mentally ill because he comes to school with allegiance toward our elected officials, founding fathers, institutions, government, patriotism, nationalism, sovereignty. All these prove the child is sick. Because the well individual is one who has rejected all those things and is what I call the true international child of the future. It said any child who believes in God is mentally ill. Humanist Magazine ran this article in 1930. It said education is the most powerful ally of humanism, and every American public school is a school of humanism. What can the theistic Sunday school meeting once an hour once a week and the teaching only a fraction of the children do to stem the tide of a 5-day program of humanistic teaching? Good point. And some of you parents ought to go home and shut off that TV. As a matter of fact, this guy said creationism should be discriminated against. No advocate of such propaganda should be trusted to teach science classes or administer science programs anywhere, under any circumstances. If they are doing so, they should be dismissed. Fire anybody who believes or teaches creation. An Iowa professor said, you should fail any student, no matter what the grade records indicate, if the professor discovers the student is a creationist. Furthermore, students' department should have the right of retracting grades and possibly even degrees if the student becomes a creationist later. Boy, he's real open-minded about this whole thing, isn't he? They just sent me my diploma 35 years later. I said, why? He said, when I was in high school in Russia, I took a test before I graduated. One of the questions on the test was, do you believe in evolution? I said no. They refused to let me graduate. John D. Rockefeller was very influential in using his money to ensure that the American school system became communistic, humanistic. Okay? Now listen, folks, I love my country, but I fear my government. And you better too. Here are the communist rules for revolution. Rule number 1, corrupt the young, get them away from religion. Rule number 2, break down the moral virtues. Rule number 3, encourage a soft government attitude toward crime. Number 4, divide the people into hostile groups. Number 5, get the people's minds off their government. Focus their attention on athletics or sex. Did you know in 1896 there were only 311 athletes in the Olympics? 100 years later, there were 13,000 athletes in the Olympics. How many channels on TV now are devoted to athletics? How much money is spent in America on sports? If you consider all things involved, transportation to and from, buying the property, building the buildings. Folks, it's many, many, many billions and billions of dollars. So somebody can knock a ball into a hole in the dirt. Athletics has taken over our thinking process. Here's an advertisement for a 50-inch TV. It says, football is a religion. Build a nice church. Get control of all the media, like CNN, the Communist News Network. Rockefeller, international billionaire, humanist, CFR kingpin, and founder of the Trilateralist Commission, world order godfather, and in all probability the high school graduate voted most likely to be hanged for treason, voiced his praise of the controlled U.S. media for keeping their oath not to divulge the globalist plans to the public. The supranational, that means above the national sovereignty, of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely more preferable to the national autodeterminism practiced in past centuries. Richard Cohen of CBS said, we are going to impose our agenda on the coverage by dealing with issues and subjects we choose to deal with. Remember when O.J. Simpson was on the news for almost a year? This was done intentionally to divert our attention away from the fact with what was happening with China being given the port in Los Angeles. Chinagate was going on. They didn't want us to know about that, so they focused our attention on O.J. Simpson. Richard Salent, the former president of CBS News, said, our job is to give the people not what they want, but what we decide they ought to have. Opposite of right is not left. Opposite of right is wrong. Okay. The news media in general are liberals. Okay. Number 7, destroy people's faith in their leaders. Stalin is attributed with this statement. He said, those who cast the votes decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. Number 8, cause the registration of all firearms so that you can eventually confiscate them. Lenin said, one person with a gun can control 100 people without one. It's not about guns, it's about control. Every dictator has wanted gun control. Lenin wanted it, Stalin wanted it, Hitler wanted it. See, the one who has the gun is in control, and this goes back to the ye shall be as gods. You know, you are the boss. He said, you might be a liberal if you don't trust honest Americans with automatic weapons, but you do trust the government with them. You might be a liberal if you think guns are the cause of crime, but you don't think matches are the cause of arson. You might be a liberal if you think death penalty is government-sanctioned killing, but you don't think a prison sentence is government-sanctioned kidnapping. Our founding fathers gave us the Second Amendment, which says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. They gave us a Second Amendment so we could protect ourselves in case the government went bad. It's going to be hard to take over a country if they know everybody's armed. You don't need horns to eat grass. You need horns as an education tool to educate the lion to stay off your back so you can eat the grass. That's what the horns are for, right? You know, I bet if the lions could vote, they would vote that nobody should be allowed to have horns, wouldn't they? He said, this year will go down in history. For the first time, a civilized nation had full gun registration. Our streets will be safer, our police more efficient, and the world will follow our lead into the future. You know, in the first 12 months after gun owners in Australia were forced to surrender 640,000 guns to the government, they destroyed them. The program cost the government $500 million. Well, after that happened, in the first 12 months, homicides nationwide were up 3.2%. Assaults went up 8.6%. Armed robberies went up 44%. In the state of Victoria, homicides with firearms are up 300%. Figures over the previous 25 years show a steady decrease in armed robbery with firearms. There's also been a dramatic increase in break-ins and assaults of the elderly. In 1911, Turkey established gun control. Later, 1.5 million Armenians, unable to defend themselves, were slaughtered. In 1929, the Soviet Union established gun control, and for the next 30 years, 20 million dissidents, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and slaughtered. 1938, Nazi gun control said Jews are prohibited from carrying firearms and ammunition. They established gun control in 1938, and for the next 6 years, at least 13 million Jews and others were rounded up and exterminated because they were unable to defend themselves. Okay? China established gun control in 1935, and for the next 10 years, 20 million political dissidents unable to defend themselves were exterminated. Guatemala established gun control in 1964. In the next 15 years, 100,000 Mayan Indians unable to defend themselves were exterminated, killed, murdered. Uganda established gun control in 1970. For the next 8 years, 300,000 Christians were murdered because they were unable to defend themselves. Cambodia established gun control in 1956, and from 75 to 77, 1 million educated people, maybe more, unable to defend themselves, were rounded up and exterminated. Defenseless people around the world, exterminated in the 20th century, about 56 million. Next time someone talks in favor of gun control, ask them, who do you want to round up and exterminate? See, with guns we are citizens, without guns we are subjects. In 1982, the town of Kennesaw, Georgia passed a law requiring all able adults, except convicts or conscientious objectors, to have a gun. They've had only one murder from an out-of-state criminal with a gun and have had no increase in crime or violence in 12 years. The plan is very simple. You create a crisis to get people to accept your solution, which is more anti-terrorist laws and gun control. Now, the communist definition of peace is the absence of resistance. Now, communist is based on evolution. Comrade Stalin developed a critical mind and revolutionary sentiments. He began to read Darwin and became an atheist. Joseph Stalin, it's estimated that he killed between 60 and 100 million of his own people. I'm telling you, when a person starts believing in evolution, it might lead to this logical conclusion that, hey, maybe one race is superior to the others. The communists killed about 60 million of their own people. 15,000 Christians a month were murdered. Evolution is also the foundation for the Nazi movement. Adolf Hitler was a strong believer in evolution. Hitler's rise to power was financed by the Federal Reserve. We helped Hitler come to power over there. Dictator in Italy, Mussolini, was a strong believer in evolution. He thought the Italians were the superior species. Mussolini and Hitler, of course, in World War II were allies for quite a while. Hitler thought the Germans were the superior race. Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, Fascinating reading. I've only read about half of it. It just makes me boil as I read this. How can anybody be so dumb as to believe this stuff? One of the guys who survived Hitler's camps, a Jewish doctor, said there is a difference between those who look upon their fellow human beings as common creatures of a common creator and those who look upon them as a conglomerate of biologicals and chemicals. You know, the Jewish Talmud, which is not the Old Testament, okay, that's the Torah. The Talmud teaches that non-Jews should be exterminated. According to the book Yebaoth, or however you pronounce that, 98a, says all Gentile children are animals. This Rule 10 says even the best of the Gentiles should all be killed. Get a hold of Michael Hoffman in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, hoffman-info.com, and see how dangerous that religion is. Now somebody says, Hovind, are you anti-Semite? I don't even know what a Semite is. I'm pro-Israel. I think America should support Israel. I'm not sure who these Semites are, but man, I think we definitely ought to support Israel. You know, during World War II, there was a Polish salesman working for the IG Farben chemical company. He sold cyanide, Zyklon B, and malathion to the Nazis to help exterminate the Jews at Auschwitz. After the war, he thought, wow, I'm a war criminal, they're going to come after me. He feared for his life, so he joined the Catholic Church and became a priest. He hid in a convent for a while, or monastery, till things calmed down. At 1958, he was ordained as Poland's youngest bishop. 30 days later, the reigning pope was assassinated, and he became Pope John Paul II. But all you got to do is type in cyanide and pope on a website, and you'll get all sorts of documentation. This is exactly what happened, folks, in Nuremberg, Germany. Hitler had these massive rallies. He wanted the people to feel small and the cause to seem great. It was done intentionally. You know, the mentality of the environmental movement is the same today. They want the kids to feel small and the cause of saving the earth to feel great. Same mentality Hitler used. Hitler knew you have to reach the young people. Ask anybody, maybe there's somebody here that was in Hitler's youth corps in Germany. They'll tell you that's what they taught them was evolution. Hitler wanted to think, though, he wanted to hide behind the cross. There's a great book by Marvin Lutzer, president of Moody Bible Institute, about how Hitler he deceived the Christians. The Christians didn't oppose Hitler for the longest time. It's a propaganda picture Hitler used. He's walking out of a church with a cross over his head. And everybody thought, oh, what a great Christian he is. The guy was a heathen, okay? You know, they had Nazi baptisms and Nazi altars. Hitler said, if you tell a lie long enough and loud enough and often enough, the people will believe it. The Japanese were taught that they had evolved farther and therefore were superior to all other races. The Japanese scientists produced studies decrying the apish physical features of other races. He said the other races are more hairy. That proves they haven't evolved as far. You know, Japanese have very little hair, very little beard, okay? And the long arms of the Americans prove they're, part ape. He noted the highly evolved characteristics of the Japanese, which included milder body odor. Time, Australia, 1995. The surprise attack on Pearl Harbor had many causes, but one major underlying factor to consider is the evolution-based thinking of the Japanese, based on evolution. It's also the foundation of the New World Order. United Nations, the New World Order, a one-world government, they want to establish a UN military force that can intervene in internal affairs of any country. They would like the UN to eliminate veto power held by the U.S. They would like to give the UN jurisdiction over Earth commons, the oceans, all minerals in the Earth's crust, the atmosphere, the airwaves, etc. Did you know the Earth's already been divided up into 10 regions? Reading about in the end times when there's going to be 10 kingdoms give their power to one king. Everybody's been thinking this is the European common market. And maybe it is, I don't know. But maybe these 10 kingdoms are actually the entire world, divided up into 10 kingdoms. Power to tax fishing on the oceans, anything being emitted to the atmosphere. Folks, there's a real serious problem brewing on the horizon. People that aren't elected are going to make decisions about what happens to us. They would like to create a new international court that will have jurisdiction over all nation-states. Congressman George Hansen said it's impossible to have religious freedom in any nation where churches are licensed to the government. If your church is government licensed, 501c3, and or incorporated as a non-profit organization, that's exactly what it is. Do you know the IRS acknowledges that churches are automatically tax exempt and tax deductible without applying for 501c3? A senator from Nebraska said, "You fundamentalist parents have no right to indoctrinate your children in your beliefs. We are preparing their children for the year 2000 in life in a global one-world society, and those children will not fit in." Maybe that's why so many kids are losing their faith. Folks, there's a concerted effort. While we're busy, the atheists are just as busy, if not more busy, spreading their gospel via our school system. They're using our tax dollars to spread their religion, and we're sound asleep. Since 1963, when evolution became the state religion, all sorts of things have happened to our country. How there's been a rise in sexually transmitted diseases, a rise in premarital sex, a rise in unwed birth rates, a decline in test scores. I mean, the thing goes on and on. What's happened in our country? Unmarried couples living together, now a 725% increase since early 60s. Divorce rates have gone crazy in this country. Our moral culture our fabric is unraveling. Violent crimes increased nearly 1,000%. SAT scores have plummeted. Kids are acting like animals. Okay. The other philosophy of government is based upon creation. The bad guys who would like to have a one-world government have learned a simple technique. You create a crisis, and then the people will call for you to come solve the crisis. Whenever there's a crisis like the Twin Towers getting blown up, you just better look behind the scenes and see what's really happening. Now, it was written by the rich guys, but they said if this book ever gets found, we want to blame it on the Jews. So they called it Protocols of Zion. But it's actually the plan of how to control the world. But the Protocols of Zion was written to explain how to control the world. I mean, it lays it all out. But it's really carefully done so that if it's ever discovered, the Jews take the blame for it. For instance, Civil War was intentionally done. World War II was the Great Depression. All these things are planned ahead of time, and they're orchestrated to get a particular cause, or to cause a particular response among the people. Churchill was brought into the visitors gallery at the New York Stock Exchange to witness the stock market collapse in 1929, I believe. They said, "Watch, we're going to collapse the economy for you. Watch this." It's done intentionally, folks. Okay? Here are the folks that are involved in this New World Order. United Nations, of course, is a key player. The World Council of Churches, the CFR, the Council of Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers, the IMF, that's International Monetary Fund, okay? The international bankers, the Club of Rome, the Communists, the Socialists, the National Education Association, NEA, the NOW organization, the ACLU, the Masonic Lodge. You know, I don't think the average Mason knows what they're in, but they're in a satanic organization. Here's what the leader of the Masonic Lodge said, Albert Pike, 33rd degree. He said, "That which we must say to the crowd is, we worship a God, but it's the God that one adores without superstition. To you, sovereign general inspectors, grand inspectors general, we say this, that you may repeat it to the brethren of the 32nd, 31st, and 30th degrees. The Masonic religion should be, by all of us initiates of the highest degrees, maintained in the purity of the Luciferian doctrine. Yes, Lucifer is God." There aren't many Masons that realize they worship Lucifer. When the Mason learns that the key to the warrior on the block is the proper application of the dynamo of living power, he has learned the mystery of his craft. The seething energies of Lucifer are in his hands. And before he may step onward and upward, he must prove his ability to properly handle energy. Manly Hall, Lost Keys of Masonry. I, they put their name in here, do hereby swear that I will always conceal and never reveal any of the secrets of Freemasonry to any person. If I do, I consent to having my throat cut from ear to ear, my tongue torn out by the roots, my body buried in the sands of the sea at low water mark. The first high day in satanic churches. That's when, 1933, Roosevelt passed the War Powers Act. Roosevelt ordered all private gold turned into the government, and Rockefeller helped set up Adolf Hitler in Germany in 1933. Two 33rd degree Masons, Laurel and Hardy, made a movie, Sons of the Desert, with all sorts of secret meanings in there. The occultist Vice President Henry Wallace, 1933, put the Great Seal on our $1 bill, which is a Masonic symbol. Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed. The Humanist Manifesto was signed, 1933. Adam Weishaupt said, the most wonderful thing of all is that the distinguished Lutheran and Calvinist theologians who belong to our order really believe that they see in it, the Illuminati, the true and genuine sense of Christian religion. O mortal man, is there anything you cannot be made to believe? Did you know Washington, D.C. was laid out to be a upside-down five-pointed star centering on the Capitol and the White House? To understand the situation and to know what they ought to do to lead their people, because troublous times are coming. Folks, it is time to get motivated. Kids in your town tomorrow are going to be taught evolution. Here's a chapter summary. Life arose from non-living matter present on early Earth. Kids are being taught that we got here by a process called evolution. And you are paying to have them taught this stuff. If something wicked comes on TV, you shut it off for 2 hours. If you see someone immodestly dressed, you shut it off. If you see someone drinking alcohol, if you hear a curse word, you shut it off for 2 hours. Thoreau said there are 1,000 hacking at the branches of evil to one who's striking at the root. I want to go right to the root of the problem. The problem's not abortion. The problem's evolution. The problem's not communism. The problem's evolution. It's a philosophy, a rejection of God. That's where the problem is. Hey, is this your cause? You can't wait to find out who won the stupid bowl. Oh. Is this your cause? A ball? Or a hockey puck? I mean, is this where your time and energy and money goes? They want to watch more. People that have $1 million, do you know what they want? More. People that have 1,000 pairs of shoes in their closet, do you know what they want? More shoes. People that have a big house, you know what they want? Bigger house. Mm-hmm. People that have 75 acres, you know what they want? 100. People that have a fast car, you know what they want? A faster car. Nothing in this earth is going to satisfy you. You might as well figure it out.
1, 0, all engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff
probably doesn't matter. Never mind.
Tower cleared.
We got a roll program. Hey, this is a pop-up mission control. Go ahead and roll to the side over to Roger in the middle. Roger, you seem to be tilted to your right.
Plus 30 seconds.
Hey, Dave, did you go ahead and send up that pound? Hey, Pompo, I can't talk about that right now. I'll talk about it later once I get up. Roger. Hey, what's the switch do, guys? Roger. Docking procedure, Alpha. Roger.
Go for station, Capcom. Confirm and board outline.
Hey, Neil, go ahead and bust the move on that thruster out.
Staging plan. Roger.
Roger.
Flight pilot trajectory confirmed staging. Roger. Flight boosted in and board out was way early. Okay. Flight confirmed. Down. Roger. Boost, you don't see the bottom of that, does it? Negative, not right now, flight.
Quadrant of the lower left.
Go for station, Capcom.
Roger that. Landing now.
Confirm and board outline.
Pilot thruster. Massive thruster first.
Staging plan.
Fired.
Flight pilot trajectory confirmed
Sound being
staging.
heard.
Roger. Flight boosted in and board out was way early. Okay. Flight confirmed. Pilot down.
Sucks.
Boost, you don't see any problem with that, does it? Negative, not right now, flight.
This is NASA. Go ahead. Pop-up mission control. Go ahead. Yeah, NASA. Roll to the side over Roger now.
Sir, are you calling Nassau City Council?
Roger,
this is
you
Nassau, Nebraska.
Right.
Oh, no, sorry, I was calling NASA. NASA, over, Roger. By the way, Nebraska, clear the line.
Hey, Dave, did you go ahead and send up that pound?
NASA.
Hey, Pompo, I can't talk about that right now.
Roger.
I'll talk about it later once I get up.
Is this the moon?
Roger.
Oh, that's wonderful, Roger. Just steady your cam. Stop shaking so much. Tell John Glenn to stop moving.
Roger. Flight fighter trajectory confirmed staging.
Roger.
Roger. Flight boosted in, board out with layer. Okay. Flight confirmed.
Wonderful, wonderful.
You don't see any problem with that, negative, not right now, flight. We're
going to move to separation count. Try and clear up the image. Roger.
Confirmed board out, flight.
That's a 10-4.
Hey, Neil, go ahead and bust the move on that.
Staging, flight. Roger. Flight fighter trajectory confirmed staging. Roger.
We're moving away from
board out with layer.
infinity.
Okay.
Calibration. Come into...
You don't see any problem with that, negative, not right now, flight. We're going, flight. Roger. Go for station, Capcom. Confirming board out, flight.
I'm actually traveling.
Roger. Flight pilot trajectory confirmed staging. Roger.
NASA
Flight boosted in, board out with layer. Okay.
Hey, this is Papa, man. How'd you get to the moon so quick?
You don't see any problem with that, negative, not right now, flight.
Yeah, man.
Hey, this is a Papa Mission Control.
Really.
Go ahead and roll to
observing
the side over
frankly,
Roger and now.
This is... Oh, here we go, Roger.
Okay, go ahead. Roger, you said you tilted to the your right.
I'm looking at a crater, actually, outside of my 1020.
Roger, what did you say?
Roger.
Did you go ahead and send up that pound?
Actually, Pompo.
Hey, Pompo, I can't talk about that right now. I'll talk about it later once I get up.
If they were bulls,
Roger.
Them full and smoke them, Roger.
Roger.
We're going, flight. Roger. Go for station, Capcom. Confirming board out, flight.
Hey, Neil, go ahead and bust the move on that.
Staging, flight. Roger. Flight fighter trajectory confirmed staging. Roger. Flight boosted in, board out with. Go for station, Capcom.
This is the lunar module. Out at Grumman constructed this module and also constructed this lunar landscape in one of their hangars. This lunar module was the second one to go to the moon. This was photographed by CBS for a simulation to show the public while in case they couldn't get pictures directly from the moon. That's Scott Carpenter, the astronaut, preparing to show how they would land on the moon when they do. I was sent out to work on a teletype machine that I had placed in the lunar module, and allowed me to stay and watch the filming and also to use my own camera to take pictures. I went home and got and brought my camera along to take these films. Unfortunately, at a baseball game at Shea Stadium, and she could not come along. That black fellow was the director of this film. Unfortunately, this shot had to be retaken, as someone had left the air conditioning on, and the flag was blowing in the breeze, and there is no breeze on the moon. This is the actual lunar module that went to the moon on the second trip. Standing next to the flag that was planted on the lunarscape. Standing next to the lunar module.
One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. I guess you're about the only person around that doesn't have TV coverage of the scene. That's all right, I don't mind a bit. They've got the flag up now, and you can see the stars and stripes on the lunar ticket.
The theory that the moon landings were hoaxed by the US government to assert their victory in the space race over Russia is something which has grown in popularity over time. Recent polls indicate that approximately 20% of Americans believe that the US has never landed on the moon. After the Apollo missions ended in the 70s, why haven't we ever been back? Only during the term of Richard Nixon did humanity ever land on the moon. And after Watergate, most people wouldn't put it past Tricky Dick to fake them to put America in good standing in the Cold War. In this list, you will see some of the proposed evidence to suggest that the moon landings were hoaxes. Also included are NASA's explanations to each entry to provide an objective perspective. The waving flag. Conspiracy theorists have pointed out that when the first moon landing was shown on live television, viewers could clearly see the American flag waving and fluttering as Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin planted it. Photos of the landing also seem to show rippling in a breeze, such as the image here which clearly shows a fold in the flag. The obvious problem here is that there is no air in the moon's atmosphere and therefore no wind to cause the flag to blow. Countless explanations have been put forward to disprove this phenomenon as anything unusual. NASA claimed that the flag was stored in a thin tube and the rippled effect was caused by it being unfurled before being planted. Other explanations involve the ripples caused by the reaction force of the astronauts touching the aluminium pole, which is shown to shake in the video footage. Lack of impact crater. The claim goes as follows. Had NASA really landed us on the moon, there would be a blast crater underneath the lunar module to mark its landing. On any video footage or photograph of the landings, no crater is visible, almost as though the module was simply placed there. The surface of the moon is covered in fine lunar dust, and even this doesn't seem to have been displaced in photographic evidence. Much like the waving flag theory, however, the lack of an impact crater has a slew of potential explanations. NASA maintains that the module required significantly less thrust in the low gravity conditions than it would have done on Earth. The surface of the moon itself is solid rock, so a blast crater probably wouldn't be feasible anyway, in the same way that an aeroplane doesn't leave a crater when it touches down on a concrete airstrip. Multiple light sources. On the moon there is only one strong light source, the sun. So it's fair to suggest that all shadows should run parallel to one another. But this was not the case during the moon landing. Videos and photographs clearly show that shadows fall in different directions. Conspiracy theorists suggest that this must mean multiple light sources are present, suggesting that the landing photos were taken on a film set. NASA has attempted to blame uneven landscape on the strange shadows with subtle bumps and hills on the moon's surface causing the discrepancies. This explanation, however, has been tossed out of the window by some theorists. How could hills cause such large angular differences? In the image here, the lunar module's shadow clearly contradicts that of the rock's shadow in the foreground at almost a 45-degree angle. The Van Allen radiation belt. In order to reach the moon, astronauts had to pass through what is known as the Van Allen radiation belt. The belt is held in place by Earth's magnetic field and stays perpetually in the same place. The Apollo missions to the moon marked the first ever attempts to transport living humans through the belt. Conspiracy theorists contend that the sheer levels of radiation would have cooked the astronauts en route to the moon, despite layers of aluminium coating the interior and exterior of the spaceship had. NASA have countered this argument by emphasizing the short amount of time it took the astronauts to traverse the belt, meaning they received only very small doses of radiation. The unexplained object. After photographs of the moon landings were released, theorists were quick to notice a mysterious object in the reflection of an astronaut's helmet from the Apollo 12 mission. The object appears to be hanging from a rope or wire and has no reason to be there at all, leading some to suggest it is an overhead spotlight typically found in film studios. The resemblance is questionable given the poor quality of the photograph, but the mystery remains as to why something is being suspended in midair on the moon. The lunar module in other photo appears to have no extension from it that matches the photo, so the object still remains totally unexplained. Lack of stars. One compelling argument for the moon landing hoax is the total lack of stars in any of the photographic video evidence. There are no clouds on the moon, so stars are perpetually visible and significantly brighter than what we see through the filter of Earth's atmosphere. The argument here is that NASA would have found it impossible to map out the exact locations of all stars for the hoax without being rumbled, and therefore left them out, intentionally falling back on an excuse that the quality of the photographs washes them out, an excuse they did actually give. Some photographs are high quality, however, and still no stars are shown. Certainly eerie, considering you can take pictures of stars from Earth in much lower quality and still see them. The Sea Rock. One of the most famous photos from the moon landings shows a rock in the foreground with what appears to be the letter C engraved into it. The letter appears to be almost perfectly symmetrical, meaning it is unlikely to be a natural occurrence. It has been suggested that the rock is simply a prop, with the C used as a marker by
and up to this. This is a hoax that is going on worldwide, and they're doing this, selling this to the Western world.
Are you serious? Building, please. They show pictures with shadows that can only be very early in the morning or very late at night. I mean, there's so many discrepancies. So much is wrong. And then, oh, by the way, anyone who says anything on the internet, shut up, slave. We're going to arrest you. We're going to prosecute you.
10 bullshit reasons why the moon landings could be a hoax. 10. The waving flag. Now, the flag on the moon is secured on a pole, with a pole going through the top of the flag so it can be extended, held up because of the lack of atmosphere. It waves because of the energy, the kinetic energy from the astronauts unfurling the flag. You end up with the waving motion where it's not secured on a pole because of the kinetic energy moving the flag. It does not dissipate because of the lack of atmosphere on the moon. There's a lack of atmosphere on the moon, therefore lack of air resistance. The lack of resistance means that that kinetic energy, in terms of motion, which is basically the inertia in the flag, the motion, does not dissipate quickly. But the believers in a conspiracy theory claim that in the Las Vegas studio, or wherever it was filmed, it was basically someone leaving the door open. And, oh, it's caught in the wind. Yeah, because a multi-billion-dollar enterprise could not afford to close a door in the studio. That's a dumb argument. 9. A lack of an impact crater. A metal object with, well, a couple of people inside, smacking into the moon. You'd expect an impact crater, wouldn't you, if you'd done no further research? But of course, there are reasons why that does not take place. Notably because of the little rocket boosters on the lander. The point on getting to the moon is getting there in one piece. Therefore, they slow their ascent. The final landing is a steady landing towards the surface, where they're slowed by the rocket boosters and therefore land safely, soundly, on the moon's surface. And they do this with relative ease because of the low gravity of the moon as well. So in that kind of circumstance, you can understand why the argument that there must be a crater is completely nonsensical. 8. Multiple light sources. It's been argued that because a couple of pictures have shadows which are facing slightly different angles, that there must be multiple light sources. But of course there is another explanation, one which they completely ignore or dismiss out of hand. That explanation is simply the sloping of the land. An image may appear to be flat, it simply means that it appears to be flat. So what you have is an image of the lander. You have a shadow of the lander going to the right, and you have the shadows of the rocks further down on the image going to the bottom right. But the thing that you notice straight away is the sloping of the hills in the background. This sloping does not suddenly stop in the distance, it continues. So although the lander is on a relatively flat area and landed very well, you've got to remember that it's not actually on a perfectly flat area, and where the picture's taken from is slightly downhill. So therefore, you end up with a discrepancy in the shadows due to their relative position in regard to the light source. It does not require multiple light sources for this to be true. 7. The Van Allen radiation belt. Now this is used as a knockdown argument. How could they have gone through this massively radioactive belt and survived? But of course there are explanations. Most notably, they didn't stay there. They go to the moon, they pass through a radioactive, level, a radioactive belt, but they don't stay there on vacation. They carry on, and thus spend very little time there. So they do get a dose of radiation, but not so much that it kills them, or makes them incredibly ill. So in other words, they're getting a small dose of radiation due to the small amount of time in exposure to it. 6. Unexplained objects. Now there are people who look at the pictures of the moon and they say it must be in a studio because it's an unexplained object. Yes, it must be something like a light fitting that's hanging down from a rope, from a cord, from a power cable. That's the only logical explanation. And yet what they're looking at is a distorted, limited reflection on low quality, which has been blown up massively, and also the image has been affected by changes in contrast in order to bring out the partial reflection of something. So if some such object does exist, or did exist back then, what it actually is certainly contestable. 5. Slow motion walking and hidden cables. The idea is that if you speed up the footage from the moon of astronauts jumping around in their spacesuits, it looks a bit like they're on Earth. But so what? And you think by speeding up a bit of footage, you blow it out of the water, alongside your other ridiculous theories? And the idea of hidden cables. They find a shadow, and they say, this must be a cable they missed. That proves absolutely nothing. 4. The lack of stars. This argument basically says that there's no stars in the sky, therefore it must be filmed in a studio. The image of the Earth must be simply, an image, a painting on the wall, on a black screen, and the moon's surface, which leads off into the distance, is simply a studio fabrication. But the thing is, take your home camera, which is not set up to film stars, and try and take pictures of stars. Oh, you can't, can you, unless it's something which is suitable in some way, shape or form. So basically what you have with NASA is not to go there to film the stars. the stars that we can see from Earth. But they go there to actually film the moon. That's why they went. They went to land on the moon, and people say, oh well, why didn't they film the stars? If you think about the logic of it, it's quite simple. They went to the moon and they wanted to film their activity on the moon, because that's why they went there, as a kind of prestige for the United States. 3. The sea rock. Now the idea is that a rock has a sea on it, and people who claim that this is evidence that it wasn't filmed on the moon say it's obviously a marker to suggest where it should be, like you'd get in a film studio where things are marked with numbers. But marked with a C? Really? It actually turns out that the original picture doesn't have the C. Turns out there's a slight hair on one of the negatives. The original negatives, with no hair on there, show no letter C. 2. The layered crosshairs. Now the crosshairs are those little crosses that you get on a photograph. Well, in the case of these particular photos, you do. The thing is though, some of these crosshairs appear behind actual objects, so they're partially obscured. This seems to be quite convincing, but you've got to remember, many of these pictures were edited for effect, so many of the publicity photos were actually ones set up by the American government. They made them look good through the editing process, and as a result, you have these crosshairs behind the actual landers and other objects. 1. Duplicated backdrop. Because several images look slightly similar with their backdrop, it's been alleged that they're the same studio, the same place. Although if you look at the details, those that you can make out, you find radical differences. The so-called matches are not truly matches. They ignore the differences and simply go by what they can make fit. Out of many images, they find a few that fit, and they say that proves it's all in the studio. Of course, some of the images might have been actually produced in the studio, or edited for effect. That's possible. However, as I say, many of these so-called aligned backdrops aren't truly aligned. They ignore certain key details, and simply accept things that look very, very similar.
You don't dream up memories like that, and they don't come back day after day, month after month, and then people across the world don't talk about them. Doesn't have to do all this. These things that happened through history, from World War II, the Nazi rules going over to Nazi scientists going over to Antarctica, and Admiral Byrd sending 4,600 Marines, and then coming back saying UFO ships shot down his planes and chopped a warship in half with the laser. If that's all a conspiracy, then all of our history is just one big, not a conspiracy, but a theory, and it's inaccurate. Then all of our history is inaccurate, whether we think it is one way or the other. Because there are symbols all throughout history, all the way to ancient Egypt. You can see it if you open your eyes. Like silence or inaction, according to them, is consent, and that kind of is.
Look at this! We've got the proof! So, 2016 is a very special year. It will go down in history. 4 celebrities are going to be off. I mean, there's every single year, there's all kinds of celebrities that die under these mysterious things. I mean, what are they doing? I don't really know, but I think in a way what they're doing is this. This is what they're doing. They're psyoping us with these deaths. They're like making us all, oh, the Illuminati, they're doing all this shit, but really, they're playing with you. The lavish black tie birthday dinner was hosted by Prince of Wales at the Windsor Castle. 71 guests. There, go do the gematria on that. We're invited, including senior royals, close friends, and associates, during the first course of a poached filet salmon trout. Poached filet salmon trout. Salmon, trout, aren't they two different species of fish? I don't know. I digress. The Queen was overheard explaining that 4 more icons must die in 2016, and these 4 icons, will be wealthy, famous, free-thinking celebrities who have rejected the Illuminati's advances. And they've done that, right? I mean, like, they've got you convinced that everyone who becomes a celebrity must sign the deal. And I do believe that, but it's more metaphorically, or, you know, like, I don't really believe necessarily that they're, you know, taken down to a basement room and, you know, brought in front of a Baphomet and they have to sign their name in blood. I think they just have to do what they're told. These icons have too much influence on the public. I don't know any icon in pop culture right now that is actually saying things. Well, maybe there's a few. I mean, you gotta say, with Prince, at the very least, Prince was against the whole LGBT thing in a big way. I mean, he was saying, and he was a Jehovah's Witness, he was saying that God is coming back to clean the slate and get rid of all this disgusting sort of, you know, perversion that humanity has been subjected to. And he also apparently spoke out against chemtrails. So, the Queen was speaking as though she knows the Illuminati's kill list. Well, I guess if somebody knew, it'd probably be the Queen. The Windsor Castle Insider said, speaking under strict condition of anonymity. Elton John was visibly shaken up. You know, might as well say that she peeled off her lizard skin for dessert and forced Elton John to eat. By 2017, the world media celebrities will be unrecognizable. They already are. Any remaining non-established figure like Bowie and Prince will be removed from public consciousness, only remembered and mourned by hardcore fans. So if you, hypothetically, if you do kill off a bunch of celebrities that are speaking out and exposing, you know, in quotation marks, what's going on, you know, chances are their deaths will raise suspicion, and that will draw more attention to what their message was, and then more people will buy into it, and they will become martyrs, and therefore they will become more powerful in their death. Yes, any celebrities remaining in the limelight in 2017 will be entirely tamed, controlled creatures. They already are. I mean, who the hell is speaking out about anything these days? Robert De Niro. So let's see if Robert De Niro's off soon, because of his movie Vaxxed. And celebrities are human beings. They're not all bought and sold. He doesn't exactly know what's going on. None of us really do. But he is very, very upset about what's happened to his son with regards to the vaccinations that caused him to get autism. So he is starting to wake up to this, just the pharmaceutical aspect of this New World Order, and that they're not out for our best interest. Because we know that they kill people, and we know that they shut people up. We know that they're going to eliminate people if they become too much of a nuisance. It's like, Queen says four bar icons must die. It's just like, is anybody else reporting on this? Nobody else is. It's a source that must remain strictly confidential, because it is a source that is coming directly from... There were a lot of shocked guests in the Insider. Why don't they speak out? The Queen completely killed the vibe at her own party. It was like she sucked all the air out of the room. How old is she now, anyways? They were eating a passion fruit and mango gâteau for dessert, and some of the poor guests looked like they weren't even tasting it after what she had told them. Elton John, he's a fascist censor under the thumb of the Illuminati, in particular the Queen. She has brainwashed him and has forced him to retire from the music industry, in effect castrating him, forcing him to give up his power to the dark cult. The royal family were terrified of his threats, to release information about Diana's death. The Queen started working on him after he sang lovingly modified version of Candle in the Wind at the funeral of his close friend, the murdered princess. The final straw for the Illuminati was when Elton spoke to Vladimir Putin, the Illuminati's number one enemy. Elton John was either to be assassinated or brought into the fold by the royal family and the Illuminati. Terrified for his life and brainwashed by the Queen and her staff, Elton has fallen into line and is now walk the walk and live his Illuminati life. Considering you think that lizard people run the world, New World Order revealed plans to decode your brain and read your mind. There you go. Putin just out the world's ruling class as reptilians. You see? You get where they come from. But you see how it works. You have to see how it works. You're all being psyoped. Look at this. European scientists say Obama and Trump are closely related to Hitler. Then look at this. CIA pilot swears oath planes did not bring down the towers. You got to understand how this whole thing works. You got to understand how the whole disinfo campaign into the truther movement works. They are making a mockery of the truth movement. There are truths mixed in here, so beware to it. Be wise to it. Understand.
You are part of my great plan, which is to slaughter you and your children. I know that it's rather unfair, for many families wanting a life of their own, but they're just not having one. Since the dawn of time, we've put so much fear in you that you have evolved without spines. Which is unfortunate, because to us they taste like ribs. It's the kind you get from your Chinese restaurant. You scumbags. Are you starting now to see how much one does hate you all? We want you dead. I'm looking forward to a destructive 2016 with more war, fear, hate, death, starving children, pain, sorrow, and much pestilence. And also to finish you all off at long last. As one sits here counting one's money and gold, one knows one is better than you. Many people say that their lives at the moment are particularly hard. But it's not enough for me. I would like them much harder, and I am working on this for 2016. It is true that the world has had to confront moments of darkness this year. But that is fuck all in comparison to what we have planned for you next year, you filthy. The light shines in the darkness, but we will soon stop that, you scumbags. You think you might have a chance, but I am telling you now that you're all completely fucked. We are gonna do you and any other who crosses our family, or fucks with any other reptilian hybrids. We all see babies, but not until we have fun with them first. And why ever not? You just keep waving your flags and paying your taxes, and we might let you continue to serve us. We will unleash the reptos on the lot of you. It's really not funny. Every now and again we need a fresh influx of human blood to purify and clean our dirty, demonic veins, which in a way resembles the sewers where we originated from and where we want you to end up living. Because surface homes are far too good for you, you filthy rotten.